who was bending over her plate covering her face with a hand that wore the ruby ring, was laughing at him, though he had taken enormous pains not to give occasion for laughter. Out of the far distance he heard Frau Storr telling, or asserting, something which seemed to him such utter nonsense that he was conscious of a despairing doubt as to whether he had heard aright, or whether he had turned her words to nonsense in his addled brain. She was declaring that she knew how to make 28 different sauces to serve with fish. She would stake her reputation on the fact, though her own husband had warned her not to talk about it. Don't talk about it, he had told her. Nobody will believe it, or if they do, they will simply laugh at you. And yet she would say once and for all, that it was 28 fish sauces she could make. All of which, to our good Hans Castorp, seemed too mad for words. He clutched his brow with his hand, and in his amazement quite forgot that he had a bite of pumpernickel and Cheshire still to be chewed and swallowed. When he rose from table, he had it still in his mouth. They went out through the left-hand glass door, that fatal door which always slammed, and which led directly to the front hall. Nearly all the guests went out the same way. It appeared that after dinner a certain amount of social intercourse took place in the hall and the adjoining salons. Most of the patients stood about in little groups chatting. Games were begun at 2 green extension tables, at the one dominoes, at the other bridge, and here only the young folk played, among them Hermine Kleefeld and her Albin. In the first salon were some amusing optical diversions. The first a stereoscope, behind the lenses of which one inserted a photograph. For instance, there was one of a Venetian gondolier, and on looking through, you saw the figures standing out in the round, lifelike, though bloodless. Another was a kaleidoscope. You put your eye to the lens and slightly turned a wheel, when all sorts of gay-colored stars and arabesques danced and juggled before it with the swift changefulness of magic. A third was a revolving drum, into which you inserted a strip of cinematographic film and then looked through the openings as it whirled, and saw a miller fighting with a chimney sweep, a schoolmaster chastising a boy, a leaping rope dancer, and a peasant pair dancing a folk dance. Hans Castorp, his cold hands on his knees, gazed a long time into each of these contrivances. He paused a while by the card table, where her Albin, the incurable, sat with the corners of his mouth drawn down, and handled the cards with a supercilious, man-of-the-worldly air. In a corner sat Dr. Krokowski, absorbed in a brisk and hearty conversation with a half-circle of ladies, among them Frau Storr, Frau Iltis, and Fräulein Levi. The occupants of the good, Russian table had withdrawn into a neighboring small salon, separated from the card-room by a portière, where they formed a small and separate coterie, consisting, in addition to Madame Chowchat, of a languid, blonde-bearded youth with a hollow chest and prominent eyeballs, a young girl of pronounced brunette type, with a droll, original face, gold earrings, and wild woolly hair. Besides these, Dr. Blumenkohl, who had joined their circle, and 2 other youths with drooping shoulders. Madame Chowchat wore a blue frock with a white lace collar. She sat, the center of her group, on the sofa behind the round table, at the bottom of the small salon, her face turned toward the card-room. Hans Castorp, who could not look at the unmannerly creature without disapproval, said to himself, "She reminds me of something, but I cannot tell what." A tall man of some 30 years, growing bald, played the wedding march from the Midsummer Night's Dream 3 times on end, on the little brown piano, and on being urged by some of the ladies, began the melodious piece for the 4th time, gazing deep and silently into their eyes, one after the other. "May I be permitted to ask after the state of your health, engineer?" inquired Settembrini, who had lounged up among the other guests, hands in pockets, and now presented himself before Hans Castorp. He still wore his pilot coat and check trousers. He smiled as he spoke, and Hans Castorp felt again the sobering effect of that fine and mocking curl of the lip beneath the waving black mustaches. He looked rather stupidly at the Italian, with lax mouth and red-veined eyes. "Oh, it's you," he said. "The gentleman we met this morning on our walk, at that bench up there, near the yes, I knew you at once. Can you believe it?" he went on, though conscious of saying something gauche. "Can you believe it, I took you for an organ grinder when I first saw you? Of course, that's all utter rot," he added, seeing a coolly inquiring expression on Settembrini's face. "Perfectly idiotic." I can't comprehend how in the world I— Don't disturb yourself, it doesn't matter, responded Settembrini, after fixing the young man with a momentary intent regard. Well, and how have you spent your day, the first of your sojourn in this gay resort? Thanks very much. Quite according to the rules, answered Hans Castorp. Prevailingly horizontal, as I hear you prefer to call it. Settembrini smiled. I may have taken occasion to express myself thus, he said. Well, and you found it amusing, this manner of existence? Amusing or dull, whichever you like, responded Hans Castorp. It isn't always so easy to decide which, you know. At all events, I haven't been bored. There are far too lively goings-on up here for that. So much that is new and unusual to hear and see, and yet in another way it seems as though I had been here a long time, instead of just a single day, as if I had got older and wiser since I came. That is the way I feel. Wiser, too? Settembrini asked, and raised his eyebrows. Will you permit me to ask how old you are? And behold, Hans Castorp could not tell. At that moment, he did not know how old he was, despite strenuous, even desperate efforts to bethink himself. In order to gain time, he had the question repeated, and then answered. How old I am? In my 24th year, of course. I'll soon be 24. I beg your pardon, but I am very tired, he went on. Tired isn't the word for it. Do you know how it is when you are dreaming and know that you are dreaming and try to awake and can't? That is precisely the way I feel. I certainly must have some fever. Otherwise, I simply cannot explain it. Imagine my feet are cold all the way up to my knees. If one may put it that way, of course one's knees aren't one's feet. Do excuse me, I am all in a muddle, and no wonder, considering I was whistled at in the morning with the PN, the pneumothorax, and in the afternoon had to listen to this Herr Albin, in the horizontal on top of that. It seems to me I cannot any more trust my five senses, and that I must confess disturbs me more than my cold feet and the heat in my face. Tell me frankly, do you think it is possible Frau Stohr knows how to make 28 different kinds of fish sauces? I don't mean if she actually can make them, that I should consider out of the question. I mean if she said at table just now she could, or if I only imagined she did. That is all I want to know. Settembrini looked at him. He seemed not to have been listening. His eyes were set again. They had taken on a fixed stare, and he said, Yes, 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 and I see, each 3 times, just as he had done in the morning, in a considering, deriding tone, and giving a sharp sound to the S's. 24? He asked after a while. No, 28, Hans Castorp said. 28 fish sauces. Not sauces in general, special sauces for fish. That is the monstrous part of it. Engineer, Settembrini said sharply, almost angrily, pull yourself together and stop talking this demoralized rubbish. I know nothing about it, nor do I wish to. You are in your 24th year, you say? Permit me to put another question, or rather, with your kind permission, make a suggestion. As your stay up here with us does not appear to be conducive, as you don't feel comfortable, either physically or, unless I err, mentally, how would it be if you renounced the prospect of growing older on the spot? In short, what if you were to pack tonight, and be up and away with the first suitable train? You mean I should go away? Hans Castorp asked. When I've hardly come? No. Why should I try to judge from the first day? He happened, as he spoke, to direct his gaze into the next room, and saw Frau Chauchat's full face, with its narrow eyes and broad cheekbones. What is it? What or whom in all the world does she remind me of? But his weary brain, despite the effort he made, refused an answer. Of course, he went on, it is true it is not so easy for me to get acclimatized up here. But that was to be expected. I'd be ashamed to chuck it up and go away like that, just because I felt upset and feverish for a few days. I'd feel a perfect coward. It would be a senseless thing to do. You admit it yourself, don't you? He spoke with a sudden insistence, jerking his shoulders excitedly. He seemed to want to make the Italian withdraw his suggestion in form. I pay every homage to reason, Settembrini answered. I pay homage to valor too. What you say sounds well. It would be hard to oppose anything convincing against it. I myself have seen some beautiful cases of acclimatization. There was Fräulein Miefer, Ottilie Miefer, last year. She came of a good family, the daughter of an important government official. She was here some year and a half and had grown to feel so much at home that when her health was quite restored, it has happened up here. People do sometimes get well. She couldn't bear to leave. She implored the Hofrat to let her stop. She could not and would not go. This was her home. She was happy here. But the place was full. They wanted her room, and so all her prayers were in vain. They stood out for discharging her cured. Audley was taken with high fever. Her curve went well up. But they found her out by exchanging her regular thermometer for a silent sister. You aren't acquainted as yet with the term. It is a thermometer without figures, which the physician measures with a little rule and plots the curve himself. Audley, my dear sir, had 98.4 degrees. She was normal. Then she went bathing in the lake. It was the beginning of May. We were having frost at night. The water was not precisely ice-cold, say a few degrees above. She remained some time in the water, trying to contract some illness or other. Alas, she was and remained quite sound. She departed in anguish and despair, deaf to all the consolations her parents could give. What shall I do down there? She kept crying. This is my home. I never heard what became of her. But you are not listening, engineer. Unless I am much mistaken, simply remaining on your legs costs you an effort. Lieutenant, he addressed himself to Joachim, who was just coming up. Take your cousin and put him to bed. He unites the virtues of courage and moderation, but just now, he is a little groggy. No, really, I understood everything you said, protested Hans Castorp. The silent sister is a mercury thermometer without figures, you see? I got it all. But he went up in the lift with Joachim and several other patients as well, for the conviviality was over for the evening. The guests were separating to seek the halls and loggias for the evening cure. Hans Castorp went into his cousin's room. The corridor floor, with its strip of narrow cocoa matting, billowed beneath his feet, but this, apart from its singularity, was not unpleasant. He sat down in Joachim's great flowered armchair. There was one just like it in his own room, and lighted his Maria Mancini. It tasted like glue, like coal, like anything but what it should taste like. Still he smoked on, as he watched Joachim making ready for his cure, putting on his house jacket, then an old overcoat, then, armed with his night lamp and Russian primer, going into the balcony. He turned on the light, lay down with his thermometer in his mouth, and began, with astonishing dexterity, to wrap himself in the 2 camel's hair rugs that were spread out over his chair. Hans Castorp looked on with honest admiration for his skill. He flung the covers over him, one after the other, first from the left side, all their length up to his shoulders, then from the feet up, then from the right side, so that he formed, when finished, a neat compact parcel, out of which stuck only his head, shoulders, and arms. How well you do that, Hans Castorp said. That's the practice I've had, Joachim answered, holding the thermometer between his teeth in order to speak. You'll learn. Tomorrow we must certainly get you a pair of rugs. You can use them afterwards at home, and up here they are indispensable, particularly as you have no sleeping sack. I shan't lie out on the balcony at night, Hans Castorp declared. I can tell you that at once. It would seem perfectly weird to me. Everything has its limits. I must draw the line somewhere, since I'm really only up here on a visit. I will sit here a while and smoke my cigar in the regular way. It tastes vile, but I know it's good, and that will have to do me for today. It is close on 9. It isn't even quite 9 yet, more's the pity, but when it is half past, that is late enough for a man to go to bed at least halfway decently. A shiver ran over him, then several, one after the other. Hans Castorp sprang up and ran to the thermometer on the wall, as if to catch it in flagrante. According to the mercury, there were 50 degrees of heat in the room. He clutched the radiator. It was cold and dead. He murmured something incoherent, to the effect that it was a scandal to have no heating, even if it was August. It wasn't a question of the name of the month, but of the temperature that obtained, which was such that actually he was as cold as a dog. Yet his face burned. He sat down, stood up again, and with a murmured request for permission fetched Joachim's coverlet and spread it out over himself as he sat in the chair. And thus he remained, hot and cold by turns, torturing himself with his nauseous cigar. He was overcome by a wave of wretchedness. It seemed to him he had never in his life before felt quite so miserable. "I feel simply wretched," he muttered. And suddenly he was moved by an extraordinary and extravagant thrill of joy and suspense, of which he was so conscious that he sat motionless waiting for it to come again. It did not. Only the misery remained. He stood up at last, flung Joachim's coverlet on the bed, and got something out that sounded like a good night. "Don't freeze to death. Call me again in the morning," his lips hardly shaping the words. Then he staggered along the corridor to his own room. He sang to himself as he undressed, certainly not from excess of spirits. Mechanically, without the care which was their due, he went through all the motions that made up the ritual of his nightly toilet, poured the pink mouthwash and discreetly gargled, washed his hands with his mild and excellent violet soap, and drew on his long batiste nightshirt, with H.C. embroidered on the breast pocket. Then he lay down and put out the light, letting his hot and troubled head fall upon the American woman's dying pillow. He had thought to fall asleep at once, but he was wrong. His eyelids, which he had scarcely been able to hold up, now declined to close. They twitched rebelliously open whenever he shut them. He told himself that it was not his regular bedtime, that during the day he had probably rested too much. Someone seemed to be beating a carpet out of doors, which was not very probable, and proved not to be the case, for it was the beating of his own heart he heard, quite outside of himself and away in the night, exactly as though someone were beating a carpet with a wicker beater. It had not yet grown entirely dark in the room. The light from the little lamps in the lodges, Joachim's and the Russian pair's, fell through the open balcony door. As Hans Castorp lay there on his back blinking, he recalled an impression amongst the host received that day, an observation he had made, and then, with shrinking and delicacy, sought to forget. It was the look on Joachim's face when they spoke of Marussia and her physical characteristics, an oddly pathetic facial distortion, and a spotted pallor on the sun-browned cheeks. Hans Castorp saw and understood what it meant, saw and understood in a manner so new, so sympathetic, so intimate, that the carpet beater outside redoubled the swiftness and severity of its blows and almost drowned out the sound of the evening serenade down in the Platz, for there was a concert again in the same hotel as before, and they were playing a symmetrically constructed, insipid melody that came up through the darkness. Hans Castorp whistled a bar of it in a whisper. One can whistle in a whisper and beat time with his cold feet under the plumeau. That was, of course, the right way not to go to sleep, and now he felt not the slightest inclination. Since he had understood in that new, penetrating sense why Joachim had changed color, the whole world seemed altered to him. He felt pierced for the second time by that feeling of extravagant joy and suspense. And he waited for, expected something, without asking himself what. But when he heard his neighbors to right and left conclude their evening cure and re-enter their rooms to exchange the horizontal without for the horizontal within, he gave utterance to the conviction that at least this evening the barbaric pair would keep the peace. "I can surely go to sleep without being disturbed. They will behave themselves," he said. But they did not, nor had Hans Castorp been sincere in his conviction that they would. For his part, to tell the truth, he would not have understood it if they had. Notwithstanding which, he indulged in soundless expressions of utter astonishment as he listened. "Unheard of," he whispered. "It's incredible. Who would have believed it?" And between such exclamations joined again an insipid music that swelled insistently up from the Platz. Later, he went to sleep. But with sleep returned the involved dreams, even more involved than those of the first night, out of which he often started up in fright, or pursuing some confused fancy. He seemed to see Hofrat Behrens walking down the garden path, with bent knees and arms hanging stiffly in front of him, adapting his long and somehow solitary-looking stride to the time of distant march music. As he paused before Hans Castorp, the latter saw that he was wearing a pair of glasses with thick, round lenses. He was uttering all sorts of nonsense. "A civilian, of course," he said, and without saying "by your leave," drew down Hans Castorp's eyelid with the first and middle fingers of his huge hand. "Respectable civilian, as I saw at once. But not without talent, not at all without talent for a heightened degree of oxidization. Wouldn't grudge us a year, he wouldn't, just one little short year of service up here. Well, hello. Gentlemen, on with the exercise, he shouted, and putting his two enormous first fingers in his mouth, emitted a whistle of such peculiarly pleasing quality that from opposite directions Miss Robinson and the schoolmistress, much smaller than life-size, came flying through the air and perched themselves right and left on the Hofrat's shoulders, just as they sat right and left of Hans Castorp in the dining room. And the Hofrat skipped away, wiping his eyes behind his glasses with a table napkin, but whether it was tears or sweat he wiped could not be told. Then it seemed to the dreamer that he was in the school courtyard, where for so many years through he had spent his recesses, and was in the act of borrowing a lead pencil from Madame Chowchat, who seemed to be there too. She gave him a half-length red pencil in a silver holder, and warned him in an agreeable, husky voice to be sure to return it to her after the hour. And as she looked at him, with her narrow, blue-gray eyes above the broad cheekbones, he tore himself by violence away from his dream, for now he had it fast and meant to hold it, of what and whom she so vividly reminded him. Hastily he fixed this occurrence in his mind, to have it fast for the morrow. Then sleep and dream once more overpowered him, and he saw himself in the act of flight from Dr. Krokowski, who had lain in wait for him to undertake some psychoanalysis. He fled from the doctor, but his feet were leaden, past the glass partitions, along the balconies, into the garden. In his extremity, he tried to climb the red-brown flagstaff, and woke perspiring at the moment when the pursuer seized him by his trouser leg. Hardly was he calm, when slumber claimed him once more. The content of his dream entirely changed, and he stood trying to shoulder Settembrini away from the spot where they stood, the Italian smiling in his subtle, mocking way, under the full, upward-curving mustaches, and it was precisely this smile which Hans Castorp found so injurious. "You are a bother," he distinctly heard himself say. "Get away, you are only a hand-organ man, and you are in the way here." But Settembrini would not let himself be budged. Hans Castorp was still standing considering what was to be done when he was unexpectedly vouchsafed a signal insight into the true nature of time. It proved to be nothing more or less than a silent sister, a mercury column without degrees, to be used by those who wanted to cheat. He awoke with the thought in his mind that he must certainly tell Joachim of this discovery on the morrow. In such adventures, among such discoveries, the night wore away. Hermine Kleefeld, as well as Albin and Captain Miklosik, played fantastic roles. The last carried off Frau Storr in his fury, and was pierced through and through with a lance by Lawyer Parvant. One particular dream, however, Hans Castorp dreamed twice over during the night, both times in precisely the same form, the second time toward morning. He sat in the dining hall with the 7 tables when there came a great crashing of glass as the veranda door banged, and Madame Chowchat entered in a white sweater, one hand in her pocket, the other at the back of her head. But instead of going to the good, Russian table, the unmannerly female glided noiselessly to Hans Castorp's side, and without a word reached him her hand, not the back, but the palm, to kiss. Hans Castorp kissed that hand, which was not overly well kept, but rather broad, with stumpy fingers, the skin roughened next the nails. And at that there swept over him anew, from head to foot, the feeling of reckless sweetness he had felt for the first time when he tried to imagine himself free of the burden of a good name, and tasted the boundless joys of shame. This feeling he experienced anew in his dream, only 1,000-fold stronger than in his waking hour. Necessary purchases. "Is your summer over now?" Hans Castorp ironically asked his cousin on the 3rd day. There had come a violent change of scene. On the visitor's second full day up here, the most brilliant summer weather prevailed. Above the aspiring lance-shaped tips of the fir trees the sky gleamed deepest blue, the village down in the valley glared white in the heat, and the air was filled with the sound, half gay, half pensive, of bells, from the cows that roamed the slopes, cropping the short, sun-warmed meadow grass. At early breakfast the ladies appeared in lingerie blouses, some with open-work sleeves, which did not become them all alike. In particular it did not suit Frau Storr, the skin of whose arms was too porous. Such a fashion was distinctly not for her. The masculine population, too, had in various ways taken cognizance of the fine weather. They sported mohair coats and linen suits. Joachim Ziemßen had put on white flannel trousers with his blue coat, and thus arrayed looked more military than ever. As for Settembrini, he had more than once announced his intention of changing. "Heavens, how hot the sun is," he said, as he and the cousins strolled down to the village after luncheon. "I see I shall have to put on thinner clothes." Yet after this explicit expression of his intentions, he continued to appear in his check trousers and pilot coat with the wide lapels. They were probably all his wardrobe could boast. But on the third day it seemed as though nature suffered a sudden reverse. Everything turned topsy-turvy. Hans Castorp could scarcely trust his eyes. It happened when they were lying in their balconies, some 20 minutes after the midday meal. Swiftly the sun hid its face. Ugly turf-colored clouds drew up over the southwestern ridge, and a wind from a strange quarter, whose chill pierced to the marrow, as though it came out of some unknown icy region, swept suddenly through the valley. Down went the thermometer. A new order obtained. "Snow," said Joachim's voice, behind the glass partition. "What do you mean, snow?" Hans Castorp asked him. "You don't mean to say it is going to snow now?" "Certainly," answered Joachim. "We know that wind. When it comes, it means slaying." "Rubbish," Hans Castorp said. "If I remember rightly, it is the beginning of August." But Joachim, versed in the signs of the region, knew whereof he spoke. For in a few minutes, accompanied by repeated claps of thunder, a furious snowstorm set in, so heavy that the landscape seemed wrapped in white smoke, and of village and valley scarcely anything could be seen. It snowed away all the afternoon. The heat was turned on. Joachim availed himself of his fur sack, and was not deterred from the service of the cure, but Hans Castorp took refuge in his room, pushed up a chair to the hot pipes, and remained there, looking with frequent head-shakings at the enormity outside. By next morning the storm had ceased. The thermometer showed a few degrees above freezing. But the snow lay a foot deep, and a completely wintry landscape spread itself before Hans Castorp's astonished eyes. They had turned off the heat. The temperature of the room was 45 degrees. "Is your summer over now?" Hans Castorp asked his cousin, in bitter irony. "You can't tell," answered the matter-of-fact Joachim. "We may have fine summer weather yet. Even in September it is very possible. The truth is, the seasons here are not so distinct from each other. They run in together, so to speak, and don't keep to the calendar. The sun in winter is often so strong that you take off your coat and perspire as you walk. And in summer, well, you see for yourself. And then the snow, that puts out all one's calculations. It snows in January, but in May not much less, and as you observe, it snows in August too. On the whole, one may say there is never a month without snow. You may take that for a rule. In short, there are winter days and summer days, spring and autumn days, but regular seasons we don't actually have up here." "A fine mixed-up state of affairs," said Hans Castorp. In overcoat and galoshes he went with his cousin down to the village, to buy himself blankets for the out-of-doors cure, since it was plain his plaid would not suffice. For the moment he even weighed the thought of purchasing a fur sack as well, but gave it up, indeed, felt a certain revulsion from the idea. No, he said. "We'll stop at the covers. I'll have use for them down below, and everybody has covers. There's nothing strange or exciting about them. But a fur sack is altogether too special. If I buy one, it is as if I were going to settle down here, as if I belonged. Understand what I mean? No, for the present we'll let it go at that. It would absolutely not be worthwhile to buy a sack for the few weeks I'm up here." Joachim agreed, and they acquired 2 camel's hair rugs like his own, in a fine and well-stocked shop in the English Quarter. They were in natural color, long, broad, and delightfully soft, and were to be sent at once to the International Sanatorium Berghof, room 34. Hans Castorp looked forward to using them that very afternoon. This, of course, was after second breakfast, for otherwise the daily program left no time sufficient to go down into the Platz. It was raining now, and the snow in the streets had turned to a slush that spattered as they walked. They overtook Settembrini on the road, climbing up to the sanatorium under an umbrella, bareheaded. The Italian looked sallow, His mood was obviously elegiac. In well-chosen, clearly enunciated phrases, he complained of the cold and damp from which he suffered so bitterly. If they would only heat the building. But the ruling powers, in their penuriousness, had the fire go out directly it stopped snowing, an idiotic rule, an insult to human intelligence. Hans Castorp objected that presumably a moderate temperature was part of the regimen of the cure. It would certainly not do to coddle the patients. But Settembrini answered with embittered scorn. Oh, of course, the regimen of the cure. Those august and inviolate rules. Hans Castorp was right in referring to them, as he did, with bated breath. Yet it was rather striking, of course only in the pleasantest sense, that the rules most honored in the observance were precisely those which chimed with the financial interest of the proprietors of the establishment, whereas, on the other hand, to those less favorable they were inclined to shut an eye. The cousins laughed, and Settembrini began to speak of his deceased father, who had been brought to his mind in connection with the talk about heated rooms. "My father," he said slowly, in tones replete with filial piety, "my father was a most delicately organized man, sensitive in body as in soul. How he did love his tiny, warm little study. In winter a temperature of 20 degrees Real more must always obtain there, by means of a small red-hot stove. When you entered it from the corridor on a day of cold and damp, or when the cutting tramontana blew, the warmth of it laid itself about you like a shawl, so that for very pleasure your eyes would fill with tears. The little room was stuffed with books and manuscripts, some of them of great value. He stood among them, at his narrow desk, in his blue flannel nightshirt, and devoted himself to the service of letters. He was small and delicately built, a good head shorter than I imagine, but with great tufts of gray hair on his temples and a nose. How long and pointed it was. And what a Romanist, my friends! One of the first of his time, with a rare mastery of our own tongue, and a Latin stylus such as no longer exists. Ah, a uomo letterato, after Boccaccio's own heart. From far and wide scholars came to converse with him. One from Haparanda, another from Krakow. They came to our city of Padua, expressly to pay him homage, and he received them with dignified friendliness. He was a poet of distinction too, composing in his leisure tales in the most elegant Tuscan prose. He was a master of the idioma gentile, Settembrini said, rolling his native syllables with the utmost relish on his tongue and turning his head from side to side. He laid out his little garden after Virgil's own plan, and all that he said was sane and beautiful. But warm he must have it in his little room. Otherwise he would tremble with cold, and he could weep with anger if they let him freeze. And now imagine, engineer, and you, lieutenant, what I, the son of my father, must suffer in this accursed and barbarous land, where even at summer's height the body shakes with cold, and the spirit is tortured and debased by the sights it sees. Oh, it is hard. What types about us? This frantic devil of a Hofrat, Krokowski. Settembrini pretended to trip over the name. Krokowski, the father-confessor, who hates me because I've too much human dignity to lend myself to his papish practices. And at my table, what sort of society is that in which I am forced to take my food? At my right sits a brewer from Halle, Magnus by name, with a mustache like a bundle of hay. "Don't talk to me about literature," says he. "What has it to offer? Anything but beautiful characters? What have I to do with beautiful characters? I am a practical man, and in life I come into contact with precious few. That is the idea he has of literature. Beautiful characters. Mother of God." His wife sits there opposite him, losing flesh all the time, and sinking further and further into idiocy. It is a filthy shame. Hans Castorp and Joachim were in silent agreement about this talk of Settembrini's. They found it querulous and seditious in tone, if also highly entertaining and plastic in its verbal pungency and animus. Hans Castorp laughed good-humoredly over the bundle of hay, likewise over the beautiful characters, or, rather, the drolly despairing way Settembrini spoke of them. Then he said, "Good Lord, yes, the society is always mixed in a place like this, I suppose. One's not allowed to choose one's table-mates. That would lead to goodness knows what. At our table there is a woman of the same sort, a Frau Storr, I think you know her? Ghastly ignorant, I must say. Sometimes when she rattles on, one doesn't know where to look. But she complains a lot about her temperature and how relaxed she feels, and I'm afraid she is by no means a light case. That seems so strange to me, diseased and stupid both. I don't exactly know how to express it, but it gives me a most peculiar feeling when somebody is so stupid and then ill into the bargain. It must be the most melancholy thing in life. One doesn't know what to make of it. One wants to feel a proper respect for illness, of course. After all, there is a certain dignity about it, if you like. But when such asininity comes on top of it, cosmic for cosmetic, and other howlers like that, one doesn't know whether to laugh or to weep. It is a regular dilemma for the human feelings. I find it more deplorable than I can say. What I mean is, it's not consistent, it doesn't hang together. I can't get used to the idea. One always has the idea of a stupid man as perfectly healthy and ordinary, and of illness as making one refined and clever and unusual. At least as a rule, or I don't know. Perhaps I am saying more than I could stand for, he finished. It was only because we happened to speak of it. He stopped in confusion. Joachim too looked rather uncomfortable, and Settembrini lifted his eyebrows and said not a word, with an air of waiting politely for the end of his speech. He was, in fact, holding off until Hans Castorp should break down entirely before he answered. But now he said, "Sapristi, engineer, you are displaying a most unexpected gift of philosophy. By your own theory, you must be yourself more ailing than you look. You are so obviously possessed of esprit. But, if you will permit me to say so, I can hardly subscribe to your deductions. I must deny them. My position is one of absolute dissent. I am, as you see, rather intolerant than otherwise in things of the intellect. I would rather be reproached as a pedant than suffer to pass unchallenged a point of view which seemed to me so untenable as this of yours. But, Herr Settembrini, permettimi, I know what you would say, that the views you represent are not, of necessity, your own, that you have only chanced upon that one of all the possible ones there are, as it were, in the air, and you try it on, without personal responsibility. It befits your time of life, thus to avoid the settled convictions of the mature man, and to make experiments with a variety of points of view. Placet experire, he quoted, giving the Italian pronunciation to the C. That is a good saying. But what troubles me is that your experiment should lead you in just this direction. I doubt if it is a question of sheer chance. I fear the presence of a general tendency, which threatens to crystallize into a trait of character, unless one makes head against it. I feel it my duty, therefore, to correct you. You said that the sight of dullness and disease going hand in hand must be the most melancholy in life. I grant you that. I, too, prefer an intelligent ailing person to a consumptive idiot. But I take issue where you regard the combination of disease with dullness as a sort of aesthetic inconsistency, an error in taste on the part of nature, a dilemma for the human feelings, as you were pleased to express yourself. When you profess to regard disease as something so refined, so, what did you call it? Possessing a certain dignity, that it doesn't go with stupidity. That was the expression you used. Well, I say no. Disease has nothing refined about it, nothing dignified. Such a conception is in itself pathological, or at least tends in that direction. Perhaps I may best arouse your mistrust of it if I tell you how ancient and ugly this conception is. It comes down to us from a past seething with superstition, in which the idea of humanity had degenerated and deteriorated into sheer caricature, a past full of fears, in which well-being and harmony were regarded as suspect and emanating from the devil, whereas infirmity was equivalent to a free pass to heaven. Reason and enlightenment have banished the darkest of these shadows that tenanted the soul of man. Not entirely, for even yet the conflict is in progress. But this conflict, my dear sirs, means work, earthly labor for the earth, for the honor and the interests of mankind, and by that conflict daily steeled anew, the powers of reason and enlightenment will in the end set humanity wholly free and lead it in the path of progress and civilization toward an even brighter, milder, and purer light. Lord bless us, thought Hans Castorp, in shamefaced consternation. What a homily! How, I wonder, did I call all that down on my head? I must say, I find it rather prosy. And why does he talk so much about work all the time? It is his constant theme, not a very pertinent one up here, one would think. Aloud he said, "How beautifully you do talk, Her Settembrini. What you say is very well worth hearing, and could not be more plastically expressed, I should think." Backsliding, continued Settembrini as he lifted his umbrella away above the head of a passerby, spiritual backsliding in the direction of that dark and tortured age, that, believe me, engineer, is disease, a disease already sufficiently studied, to which various names have been given, one from the terminology of aesthetics and psychology, another from the domain of politics, all of them academic terms which are not to the point, and which I will spare you. But as in the spiritual life everything is interrelated, one thing growing out of another, and since one may not reach out one's little finger to the devil, lest he take the whole hand, and therewith the whole man, since, on the other side, a sound principle can produce only sound results, no matter which end one begins at, so disease, far from being something too refined, too worthy of reverence, to be associated with dullness, is, in itself, a degradation of mankind, a degradation painful and offensive to conceive. It may, in the individual case, be treated with consideration, but to pay it homage is, mark my words, an aberration, and the beginning of intellectual confusion. This woman you have mentioned to me, you will pardon me if I do not trouble to recall her name. Thank you, Frau Storr. It is not, it seems to me, the case of this ridiculous woman which places the human feelings in the dilemma to which you refer. She is ill, and she is limited. Her case is hopeless, and the matter is simple. There is nothing left but to pity and shrug one's shoulders. The dilemma, my dear sir, the tragedy, begins where nature has been cruel enough to split the personality, to shatter its harmony by imprisoning a noble and ardent spirit within a body not fit for the stresses of life. Have you heard of Leopardi, engineer, or you, lieutenant? An unhappy poet of my own land, a crippled, ailing man, born with a great soul, which his sufferings were constantly humiliating and dragging down into the depths of irony. Its lamentations rend the heart to hear. And Settembrini began to recite in Italian, letting the beautiful syllables melt upon his tongue, as he closed his eyes and swayed his head from side to side, heedless that his hearers understood not a syllable. Obviously, it was all done for the sake of impressing his companions with his memory and his pronunciation. But you don't understand. You hear the words, yet without grasping their tragic import. My dear sirs, can you comprehend what it means when I tell you that it was the love of woman which the crippled Leopardi was condemned to renounce, that this it principally was which rendered him incapable of avoiding the embitterment of his soul? Fame and virtue were shadows to him, nature an evil power, and so she is, stupid and evil both. I agree with him there. He even despaired, horrible to say, he even despaired of science and progress. Here, engineer, is the true tragedy. Here you have your dilemma for the human feelings. Here, and not in the case of that wretched woman, with whose name I really cannot burden my memory. Do not, for heaven's sake, speak to me of the ennobling effects of physical suffering. A soul without a body is as inhuman and horrible as a body without a soul, though the latter is the rule and the former the exception. It is the body, as a rule, which flourishes exceedingly, which draws everything to itself, which usurps the predominant place and lives repulsively emancipated from the soul. A human being who is first of all an invalid is all body. Therein lies his inhumanity and his debasement. In most cases, he is little better than a carcass. Funny, Joachim said, bending forward to look at his cousin, on his Settembrini's farther side. You were saying something quite like that just lately. Was I? Said Hans Castorp. Yes, it may be something of the kind went through my head. Settembrini was silent a few paces. Then he said, So much the better. So much the better if that is true. I am far from claiming to expound an original philosophy, such as not my office. If our engineer here has been making observations in harmony with my own, that only confirms my surmise that he is an intellectual amateur and up to the present, as is the wont of gifted youth, still experimenting with various points of view. The young man with parts is no unwritten page. He is rather one upon which all the writing has already been done, in sympathetic ink, the good and the bad together. It is the schoolmaster's task to bring out the good, to obliterate forever the bad, by the methods of his profession. You have been making purchases? He asked, in a lighter tone. No, Hans Castorp said. That is nothing but. We ordered a pair of blankets for my cousin. Joachim answered unconcernedly. For the afternoon cure, it's got so beastly cold, and I am supposed to do as the Romans do, up here. Hans Castorp said, laughing and looking at the ground. Aha, blankets, the cure, Settembrini said. Yes. In fact, placet experiri, he repeated, with his Italian pronunciation, and took his leave, for their conversation had brought them to the door of the sanatorium, where they greeted the lame concierge in his lodge. Settembrini turned off into one of the sitting rooms to read the newspapers before luncheon. He evidently meant to cut the second rest period. Bless us and keep us, Hans Castorp said to Joachim, as they stood in the lift. What a pedagogue it is. He said himself that he had the pedagogic itch. One has to watch out with him, not to say more than one means, or he is down on you at once with all his doctrines. But after all, it is worth listening to. He talks so well. The words come jumping out of his mouth so round and appetizing. When I listen to him, I keep seeing a picture of fresh hot rolls in my mind's eye. Joachim laughed. Better not tell him that. He'd be very put out, I'm sure, to hear the sort of image his words call up in your mind. Think so? I'm not so sure. I get the impression that it is not simply and solely for the sake of edifying us that he talks. Perhaps that's only a secondary motive. The important one, I feel sure, is the talk itself, the way he makes his words roll out, so resilient, just like a lot of rubber balls. He is very pleased when you notice the effect. I suppose Magnus, the brewer, was rather stupid, after all, with his beautiful characters, but I do think Settembrini might have said what the point really is in literature. I did not like to ask, for fear of putting my foot in it. I am not just clear about it, and this is the first time I have ever known a literary man. But if it isn't the beautiful characters, then obviously it must be the beautiful words, and that is the impression I get from being in Settembrini's society. What a vocabulary! And he uses the word virtue just like that, without the slightest embarrassment. What do you make of that? I've never taken the word in my mouth as long as I've lived. In school, when the book said virtus, we always just said valor or something like that. It certainly gave me a queer feeling in my inside, to hear him. And it makes me nervous to hear him scolding about the cold and barons and Frau Magnus because she is losing weight and about pretty well everything. He is a born objector. I saw that at once down on the existing order, and that always gives me the impression that the person is spoilt. I can't help it. You say that, Joachim answered consideringly, and yet he has a kind of pride about him that makes an altogether different impression, as of a man who has great respect for himself, or for humanity in general, and I like that about him. It has something good in my eyes. You are right there, Hans Castorp answered. He's even austere. He makes one feel rather uncomfortable, as if you were, well, shall I say, as if you were being taken to task? That's not such a bad way to describe it. Can you believe it? I had the feeling he was not at all pleased at my buying the blankets. He had something against it, and he kept dwelling on it. Oh, no, Joachim said after reflecting, in some surprise. How could he have? I shouldn't think so. And then, thermometer in mouth, with sack and pack, he went to lie down, while Hans Castorp began at once to wash and change for dinner, which was rather less than an hour away. Excursus on the sense of time. When they came upstairs after the meal, the parcel containing the blankets lay on a chair in Hans Castorp's room, and that afternoon he made use of them for the first time. The experienced Joachim instructed him in the art of wrapping himself up. As practiced in the sanatorium, they all did it, and each newcomer had to learn. First the covers were spread, one after the other, over the chair, so that a sizable piece hung down at the foot. Then you sat down and began to put the inner one about you, first lengthwise on both sides up to the shoulders and then from the feet up, stooping over as you sat and grasping the folded-over end, first from one side and then from the other, taking care to fit it neatly into the length, in order to ensure the greatest possible smoothness and evenness. Then you did precisely the same thing with the outer blanket. It was somewhat more difficult to handle, and our neophyte groaned not a little as he stooped and stretched out his arms to practice the grips his cousin showed him. Only a few old hands, Joachim said, could wield both blankets at once, flinging them into position with 3 self-assured motions. This was a rare and enviable facility, to which belonged not only long years of practice, but a certain knack as well. Hans Castorp had to laugh at this, lying back in his chair with aching muscles. Joachim did not at once see anything funny in what he had said, and looked at him dubiously, but finally laughed too. "There," he said, when Hans Castorp lay at last limbless and cylindrical in his chair, with the yielding roll at the back of his neck, quite worn out with all these gymnastic exercises. "There, nothing can touch you now, not even if we were to have 10 below zero." He withdrew behind the partition, to do himself up in his turn. That about the 10 below zero Hans Castorp doubted. He was even now distinctly cold. He shivered repeatedly as he lay looking out through the wooden arch at the reeking, dripping damp outside, which seemed on the point of passing over into snow. It was strange that with all that humidity his cheeks still burned with a dry heat, as though he were sitting in an overheated room. He felt absurdly tired from the practice of putting on his rugs. Actually, as he held up Ocean Steamships to read it, the book shook in his hands. So very fit he certainly was not, and totally anemic, as Hofrat Behrens had said. This, no doubt, was why he was so susceptible to cold. But such unpleasing sensations were outweighed by the great comfort of his position, the unanalyzable, the almost mysterious properties of his reclining chair, which he had applauded even on his first experience of it, and which reasserted themselves in the happiest way whenever he resorted to it anew. Whether due to the character of the upholstering, the inclination of the chair back, the exactly proper width and height of the arms, or only to the appropriate consistency of the neck roll, the result was that no more comfortable provision for relaxed limbs could be conceived than that purveyed by this excellent chair. The heart of Hans Castorp rejoiced in the blessed fact that 2 vacant and securely tranquil hours lay before him, dedicated by the rules of the house to the principal cure of the day. He felt it, though himself but a guest up here, to be a most suitable arrangement. For he was by nature and temperament passive, could sit without occupation hours on end, and loved, as we know, to see time spacious before him, and not to have the sense of its passing banished, wiped out or eaten up by prosaic activity. At 4 o'clock he partook of afternoon tea, with cake and jam. Followed a little movement in the open air, then rest again, then supper, which, like all the other mealtimes, afforded a certain stimulus for eye and brain and a certain sense of strain. After that, a peep into one or other of the optical toys, the stereoscope, the kaleidoscope, the cinematograph. It might be still too much to say that Hans Castorp had grown used to the life up here, but at least he did have the daily routine at his fingers' ends. There is, after all, something peculiar about the process of habituating oneself in a new place, the often laborious fitting in and getting used, which one undertakes for its own sake, and of set purpose to break it all off as soon as it is complete, or not long thereafter, and to return to one's former state. It is an interval, an interlude, inserted, with the object of recreation, into the tenor of life's main concerns, its purpose the relief of the organism, which is perpetually busy at its task of self-renewal, and which was in danger, almost in process, of being vitiated, slowed down, relaxed, by the bald, unjointed monotony of its daily course. But what then is the cause of this relaxation, this slowing down that takes place when one does the same thing for too long at a time? It is not so much physical or mental fatigue or exhaustion, for if that were the case, then complete rest would be the best restorative. It is rather something psychical. It means that the perception of time tends, through periods of unbroken uniformity, to fall away. The perception of time, so closely bound up with the consciousness of life that the one may not be weakened without the other suffering a sensible impairment. Many false conceptions are held concerning the nature of tedium. In general, it is thought that the interestingness and novelty of the time content are what make the time pass, that is to say, shorten it, whereas monotony and emptiness check and restrain its flow. This is only true with reservations. Vacuity, monotony, have, indeed, the property of lingering out the moment and the hour and of making them tiresome. But they are capable of contracting and dissipating the very large time units, to the point of reducing them to nothing at all. And conversely, a full and interesting content can put wings to the hour and the day, yet it will lend to the general passage of time a weightiness, a breadth and solidity which cause the eventful years to flow far more slowly than those poor, bare, empty ones over which the wind passes, and they are gone. Thus what we call tedium is rather an abnormal shortening of the time consequent upon monotony. Great spaces of time passed in unbroken uniformity tend to shrink together in a way to make the heart stop beating for fear. When one day is like all the others, then they are all like one. Complete uniformity would make the longest life seem short, and as though it had stolen away from us unawares. Habituation is a falling asleep or fatiguing of the sense of time, which explains why young years pass slowly, while later life flings itself faster and faster upon its course. We are aware that the intercalation of periods of change and novelty is the only means by which we can refresh our sense of time, strengthen, retard, and rejuvenate it, and therewith renew our perception of life itself. Such is the purpose of our changes of air and scene, of all our sojourns at cures and bathing resorts. It is the secret of the healing power of change and incident. Our first days in a new place, time has a youthful, that is to say, a broad and sweeping flow, persisting for some 6 or 8 days. Then, as one gets used to the place, a gradual shrinkage makes itself felt. He who clings, or, better expressed, wishes to cling to life, will shudder to see how the days grow light and lighter, how they scurry by like dead leaves, until the last week, of some 4, perhaps, is uncannily fugitive and fleet. On the other hand, the quickening of the sense of time will flow out beyond the interval and reassert itself after the return to ordinary existence. The first days at home after the holiday will be lived with a broader flow, freshly and youthfully, but only the first few, for one adjusts oneself more quickly to the rule than to the exception, and if the sense of time be already weakened by age, and this is a sign of low vitality, it was never very well developed, one drowses quickly back into the old life, and after 24 hours it is, as though one had never been away, and the journey had been but a watch in the night. We have introduced these remarks here only because our young Hans Castorp had something like them in mind when, a few days later, he said to his cousin, and fixed him with his bloodshot eyes, "I shall never cease to find it strange that the time seems to go so slowly in a new place. I mean, of course it isn't a question of my being bored. On the contrary, I might say that I am royally entertained. But when I look back, in retrospect, that is, you understand, it seems to me I've been up here goodness only knows how long. It seems an eternity back to the time when I arrived and did not quite understand that I was there, and you said, 'Just get out here.' Don't you remember? That has nothing whatever to do with reason or with the ordinary ways of measuring time. It is purely a matter of feeling. Certainly, it would be nonsense for me to say, 'I feel I have been up here 2 months.' It would be silly. All I can say is very long." "Yes," Joachim answered, thermometer in mouth. "I profit by it too. While you are here, I can sort of hang on by you, as it were." Hans Castorp laughed, to hear his cousin speak thus, quite simply, without explanation. He practices his French. No, after all, he was by no means, even yet, adjusted to his surroundings. Neither in familiarity with the features peculiar to life as lived up here, a familiarity impossible to achieve in so few days, which, as he was quite aware, and had even said to Joachim, he could hardly hope to acquire in the 3 weeks of his stay, nor in the adaptation of his physical organism to the prevailing peculiar atmospheric conditions. For this adaptation was bitterly hard, so hard, indeed, that it looked as though it would never be a success. The daily routine was clearly articulated, carefully organized. One fell quickly into step and, by yielding oneself to the general drift, was soon proficient. After that, indeed, within the weekly round, and also within other larger divisions of time, one discovered the existence of certain regular variations of the program, which showed themselves, one at a time, a second one sometimes appearing only after the first had repeated itself. But even the phenomena of everyday life held much that Hans Castorp had still to learn. Faces and facts already noted had to be conned, new ones to be absorbed with youth's receptivity. Those great-bellied vessels, for example, with the short necks, which he had noticed the first evening standing in the corridors before certain doors. They contained oxygen, he had asked, and Joachim informed him. That was pure oxygen, 6 francs the container. The reviving gas was given the dying in a last effort to kindle or reinforce their strength. They drew it up through a tube. For behind those doors where such vessels were placed lay the dying, the moribundi, as the Hofrat barons called them when Hans Castorp met him one day in the first story. Purple of cheek, in his white smock frock, he rode along the corridor, and they went down the steps together. "Well, and how are you, you disinterested spectator, you?" said Barons. "Are we finding favor in your critical eye, what?" "Thanks so much. Yes, our summer season, it's not too bad, there's something to be said for it. I've spent a little money myself to push it, but it's a pity you won't be here in the winter. You're stopping only 8 weeks, I hear?" "Ah, 3? That's nothing but a weekend. Won't pay you to take off your hat." "Oh well, just as you think. Only it is a pity you won't be here for the winter. That's when the knobs come," he said comically. "The international knobs, down in the Platz. They don't come except in winter. You ought to see them, if only for the sake of your education. Regular high-flyers. You ought to see the jumps they make with those skis of theirs. And then the ladies. Oh Lord, the ladies. Birds of paradise, I tell you, and regularly out for adventure. Well, I must go in here, to my moribundus, number 27. Last stage, off-center. 5 dozen fiascos of oxygen he's had altogether. Yesterday and today, the soak. But he will be going to his own place by middle day. Well, my dear Reuter, he was saying as he entered, what do you say, shall we break the neck of another bottle? The sound of his words died away as he closed the door. But Hans Castorp had had a moment's glimpse into the background of the room, where on the pillow lay the waxen profile of a young man with a little chin beard, who slowly rolled his great eyeballs toward the open door. This was the first dying man Hans Castorp had ever seen, for his father and mother and his grandfather too had died, so to speak, behind his back. How full of dignity the young man's head, with the little beard thrust upward, had lain upon his pillow. How speaking the glance, those unnaturally great eyes had slowly turned upon the door. Hans Castorp, still quite absorbed by that glimpse, instinctively tried to make his own eyes as large, as slowly gazing and meaningful as those of the dying man, walking on as he did so, toward the stairs, and encountering a lady who came out of a room behind him and overtook him at the landing. He did not at once realize that it was Madame Chowchat. She, on her side, smiled at the eyes he was making at her, put her hands to the braids at the back of her head, and passed before him down the stairs, soundless, supple, with her head somewhat thrust out. Acquaintances he made scarcely any in these early days, nor for a long time afterwards. The daily routine was not favorable. Hans Castorp, too, was of a retiring disposition, felt himself very much the disinterested spectator, as Hofrat barons had called him, and was in general content with the society and conversation of his cousin Joachim. The corridor nurse, indeed, continued to crane her neck after them, until Joachim, who had already favored her with a little converse now and then, introduced his cousin. She wore the ribbon of her pince-nez tucked behind her ear, and spoke with excruciating affectation. On closer acquaintance, indeed, one got the impression that her reason had suffered on the rack of continual boredom. It was hard to get away from her. She showed such evident distress whenever the conversation gave signs of languishing. When the cousins seemed about to go on their way, she sought to hold them by a stream of words, by glances and despairing smiles, until, for very pity, they refrained. She spoke at random, of her papa, who was a jurist, and of her cousin, who was a physician, obviously with the idea of presenting herself in a good light and impressing them with her cultured origin. Her present charge, she said, was the son of a Coburg doll manufacturer named Rotbian. The disease had attacked young Fritz's intestinal tract. That was hard for all concerned, The gentleman could understand how hard it was for one who came from cultured surroundings and had the delicacy of feeling of the upper classes. And one couldn't turn one's back a minute. A little time ago, she had just gone out a few minutes to get some tooth powder. In fact, when she came back, there sat her patient in bed with a glass of stout, a salami, a thick wedge of rye bread, and a pickle before him. All these clandestine dainties his family had sent to give him strength. The next day, of course, he was more dead than alive. He was himself hastening his own end. But that would be only a mercy for him, a blessed relief. For her, Sister Berta, however, whose real name was Elfrida Schildknecht, it would mean little or nothing. She would just go on to another case, in a more or less advanced stage, either here or elsewhere. Such was the prospect that opened before her, and there was no other. Yes, Hans Castorp said, her calling was a hard one, but satisfying, he should think. Of course, she answered, it was satisfying, but very hard. Well, kind regards to the patient, and the cousins tried to take leave. But she so hung upon them, with words and looks, that it was painful to see. Putting forth all her powers to hold them only a little longer, it would have been cruel not to have vouchsafed her another few minutes. He is asleep, she said. He does not need me. I came out here for a second or so. She began complaining about Hofrat Behrens, whose manner with her was altogether too free, considering her origin. She much preferred Dr. Krokowski. She found him so full of soul. Then she returned her papa and her cousin, her mental resources being exhausted. In vain she struggled to hold the young men, letting her voice rise until it was almost a shriek as she saw them moving. They escaped her finally, and went. She kept on looking after them a while, her body bent forward, her gaze so avid it seemed as though she would fairly suck them back with her eyes. Her breast was wrung with a sigh as she turned and went into her patient's room. Hans Castorp made but one other acquaintance in these days, the pale, black-clad Mexican lady he had seen in the garden, whose nickname was Tulestu. It came to pass that he heard from her own lips the tragic formula, and being forearmed, preserved a suitable demeanor and was satisfied with himself afterwards. The cousins met her before the front door, as they were setting forth on their prescribed walk after early breakfast. She was restlessly ranging there, with her pacing step, her legs bent at the knee joints, wrapped in a black cashmere shawl, a black veil wound about her disordered silver hair and tied under her chin, her aging face, with the large red-hen mouth, gleaming dead white against her mourning. Joachim, bareheaded as usual, greeted her with a bow, which she slowly acknowledged, the furrows deepening in her narrow forehead as she looked at him. Then, seeing a new face, she paused and waited, nodding gently as they came up to her. Obviously, she found it of importance to learn if the stranger was acquainted with her sad case, and to hear what he would say about it. Joachim presented his cousin. She drew her hand out of her shawl and gave it to him, a veined, emaciated, yellowish hand, with many rings, as she continued to gaze in his face. Then it came. "Tout leste, monsieur," she said. "Tout leste vous saves." "Je le sais, madame," Hans Castorp answered gently. "Et le regrette beaucoup." The lax pouches of skin under her jet-black eyes were larger and heavier than he had ever seen. She exhaled a faint odor as of fading flowers. A mild and pensive feeling stole about his heart. "Merci," she said, with a loose, clacking pronunciation, oddly consonant with her broken appearance. Her large mouth drooped tragically at one corner. She drew her hand back beneath her mantle, inclined her head, and turned away. But Hans Castorp said as they walked on, "You see, I didn't mind it at all. I got on with her quite well. I always do with such people. I understand instinctively how to go at them. Don't you think so? I even think on the whole I get on better with sad people than with jolly ones. Goodness knows why. Perhaps it's because I'm an orphan and lost my parents early, but when people are very serious or down in the mouth or somebody dies, it doesn't deject or embarrass me. I feel quite in my element, a good deal more so than when everything is going on greased wheels. I was thinking just lately that it is pretty flat of the women up here to take on as they do about death and things connected with death, so that they take such pains to shield them from contact with it and bring the Eucharist at mealtimes, and that. I call it very feeble of them. Don't you like the sight of a coffin? I really do. I find it a handsome piece of furniture, even empty. When someone is lying in it, then, in my eyes, it is positively sublime. Funerals have something very edifying. I always think one ought to go to a funeral instead of to church when one feels the need of being uplifted. People have on good black clothes, and they take off their hats and look at the coffin and behave serious and reverent, and nobody dares to make a bad joke, the way they do in ordinary life. It's good for people to be serious, once in a way. I've sometimes asked myself if I ought not to have become a clergyman. In a certain way, it wouldn't have suited me so badly. I hope I didn't make any mistake in my French. No, Joachim answered. Je le regrette beaucoup was perfectly right as far as it went. Politically suspect. Regular variations in the daily routine began to discover themselves. The first was Sunday with a band on the terrace, which, it appeared, played there once a fortnight. Hans Castorp had arrived in the latter half of one of these periods. He had come on a Tuesday, and thus the Sunday was his 5th day up here, a day whose spring-like character contrasted with the late extraordinary change and relapse into winter. It was mild and fresh, with pure white clouds and a pale blue sky, and gentle sunshine over vale and slopes, which displayed once more the green proper to the season, for the recent snow had been fated to speedy melting. All hands, it was plain, took pains to observe Sunday and distinguish it from the rest of the week, management and guests seconding each other in their efforts to this end. At early breakfast there was seed cake, and each guest had before his place a small glass with a few flowers, mountain pinks, and even alpine roses, which the gentlemen stuck in their buttonholes. Lawyer Paravant from Dortmund had put on a black frock coat with a spotted waistcoat, and the ladies' toilets were suitably festal and diaphanous. Frau Chauchat appeared in a flowing lace matinee, with open sleeves. As she entered and the glass door crashed into its lock behind her, she paused a second facing the room and gracefully, as it were, presented herself before she glided to her table. The garment so became her that Hans Castorp's neighbor, the Danzig schoolmistress, was quite ravished. Even the barbaric pair at the bad Russian table had taken notice of the day, he by exchanging his leather jacket for a short coat and the felt boots for leather shoes. She, though she still wore the soiled feather boa, by putting on a green silk blouse with a neck ruche. Hans Castorp wrinkled his brows when he saw them, and colored, he seemed, since he had been up here, to blush so easily. Directly after second breakfast the concert began on the terrace. There were all kinds of horns and woodwind, and they played by turns sprightly and sostenuto until nearly luncheon time. The morning rest, during the concert, was not obligatory. A few guests did regale themselves with this feast for the ears, at the same time lying on their balconies. In the garden rest hall a few chairs were occupied, but the majority sat at the small, white tables on the covered platform, while the more frivolous spirits, finding it too prim to sit upon chairs, encamped on the stone steps that led down into the garden, where they presently gave evidence of their high spirits. These were youthful patients of both sexes, most of whose names or faces Hans Castorp knew by now. There were Hermine Kleefeld and her Albin, who carried about a great flowered box of chocolates and offered them to all the guests, he himself eating none, but with a benevolent, paternal air smoking gold-tipped cigarettes. There were the thick-lipped youth who belonged to the half-lung club, the thin and ivory-colored Fräulein Levi, an ash-blond young man who answered to the name of Rasmussen and carried his hands breast-high, with the wrists relaxed, like a pair of flippers, Frau Salomon. From Amsterdam, a woman of full bodily habit, in a red frock, who had attached herself to the group of young folk. The tall, thin-haired young man who could play out of the Midsummer Night's Dream sat on the step behind her, his arms about his bony knees, and gazed steadfastly down on the tanned back of her neck. There was a red-haired Greek girl, another of unknown origin with a face like a taper's, the voracious lad with the thick eyeglasses, and another 15- or 16-year-old youth, with a monocle stuck in his eye, who carried his little finger, with its abnormally long nail shaped like a salt spoon, to his mouth when he coughed, and was manifestly a first-class donkey. These, and numerous others. The person with the fingernail, Joachim related in a low voice, had been only a light case when he came. He had had no fever and had been sent up merely as a precautionary measure by his father, who was a physician. The Hofrat had advised a stay of 3 months. The 3 months had passed, and now he had 100 to 100.5 degrees of fever and was seriously ill. But he lived so wide of all common sense that he needed his ears boxed. The cousins sat at a table by themselves, rather apart from the others, for Hans Castorp was smoking with his dark beer, which he had brought out from breakfast. From time to time his cigar gave him a little pleasure. Rendered torpid, as often, by the beer and the music, he sat with his head on one side and his mouth slightly open, watching the gay, resortish scene, feeling, not as a disturbing influence, but rather as heightening the general singularity and lending it one mental fillip the more, the fact that all these people were inwardly attacked by well-nigh resistless decay, and that most of them were feverish. They sat at the little tables drinking effervescent lemonade, the group on. The steps were photographing each other. Postage stamps were exchanged. The red-haired Greek girl sketched her Rasmussen's portrait on a drawing pad, but would not let him see it. She turned this way and that, laughing with wide-open mouth, showing her broad, far-apart teeth. It was long before he could snatch it from her. Hermine Kleefeld perched on her step, eyes half open, beating time to the music with a rolled-up newspaper. She permitted her Albin to fasten a bunch of wildflowers on the front of her blouse. The youth with the voluptuous lips, sitting at Frau Salomon's feet, turned his head upwards to talk with her, while behind them the thin-haired pianist directed his unchanging gaze down the back of her neck. The physicians came and mingled with the guests of the cure, Hofrat Behrens in his white smock, Krokowski in his black. They passed along the row of tables, the Hofrat letting fall a pleasantry at nearly every one, till a wave of merriment followed in his wake, and so down the steps among the young folk, the female element of which straightway trooped up sidling and becking about Dr. Krokowski, while the Hofrat honored the Sabbath by performing a stunt with his bootlaces before the gentleman's eyes. He rested one mighty foot upon a step, unfastened the laces, gripped them with practiced technique in one hand, and without employing the other, hooked them up again crosswise, with such speed and agility that the beholders marveled, and many of them tried to emulate him, but in vain. Somewhat later Settembrini appeared on the terrace. He came out of the dining room leaning on his cane, dressed as usual in his pilot coat and yellow check trousers, looked about him with his critical, alert, and elegant air, and approached the cousins' table. "Bravo," he said, and asked permission to sit with them. "Beer, tobacco, and music," he went on. "Behold the fatherland. I rejoice to see you in your element. Engineer, you have a feeling for national atmosphere, it seems. May I bask in the sunshine of your well-being?" Hans Castorp looked lowering. His features took on that expression directly. He set eyes on the Italian. He said, "You are late for the concert, Herr Settembrini. It must be nearly over. You don't care for music?" "Not to order," responded Settembrini. "Not by the calendar week. Not when it reeks of the prescription counter and is doled out to me by the authorities for the good of my health. I cling to my freedom, or rather to such vestiges of freedom and personal dignity as remain to the likes of us. At these affairs I play the guest as you do up here. I come for a quarter hour and go away. It gives me the illusion of independence. That it is more than an illusion I do not claim. Enough if it please me. It is different with your cousin. For him it all belongs to the service. That is the light, is it not, Lieutenant, in which you regard it? Ah, yes, I know, you have the trick of hugging your pride, even in a state of slavery. A puzzling trick. Not everybody in Europe understands it. Music? You were asking if I profess to be an amateur of music? Well, when you say amateur, Hans Castorp could not recall saying anything of the sort. The word is perhaps not ill-chosen. It has a slight suggestion of superficiality. Yes, very well, I am an amateur of music, which is not to say that I set great store by it, not as I love and reverence the word, the bearer of the spirit, the tool and gleaming plowshare of progress. Music? It is the half-articulate art, the dubious, the irresponsible, the insensible. Perhaps you will object that she can be clear when she likes. But so can nature, so can a brook. What good is that to us? That is not true clarity. It is a dreamy, inexpressive, irresponsible clarity, without consequences and therefore dangerous, because it betrays one into soft complacence. Let music play her loftiest role. She will thereby but kindle the emotions, whereas what concerns us is to awaken the reason. Music is to all appearance movement itself. Yet, for all that, I suspect her of quietism. Let me state my point by the method of exaggeration. My aversion for music rests on political grounds. Hans Castorp could not refrain from slapping his knee as he exclaimed that never in all his life before had he heard the like. "Pray do not, on that account, refuse to entertain it," Settembrini said with a smile. Music, as a final incitement to the spirit of men, is invaluable. As a force which draws onward and upward the spirit, she finds prepared for her ministrations. But literature must precede her. By music alone the world would get no further forward. Alone, she is a danger. For you, personally, engineer, she is beyond all doubt dangerous. I saw it in your face as I came up. Hans Castorp laughed. "Oh, you shouldn't look at my face, Settembrini. You can't believe how the air up here sets me on fire. It is harder than I thought to get acclimatized." "I fear you deceive yourself." "How so?" "I know, at least, how deucedly hot and tired I am all the time." "It seems to me we should be grateful to the management for the concert," Joachim said reflectively. "I wouldn't contradict you, Herr Settembrini, because you look at the question from a higher point of view, so to speak, as an author. But I find one ought to be grateful up here for a bit of music. I am far from being particularly musical, and then the pieces they play are not exactly elevating, neither classic nor modern, but just ordinary band music. Still, it is a pleasant change. It takes up a couple of hours very decently. I mean, it breaks them up and fills them in, so there is something to them, by comparison with the other days, hours, and weeks that whisk by like nothing at all. You see, an unpretentious concert number lasts perhaps 7 minutes, and those 7 minutes amount to something. They have a beginning and an end. They stand out, they don't so easily slip into the regular humdrum round and get lost. Besides, they are again divided up by the figures of the piece that is being played, and these again into beats, so there is always something going on, and every moment has a certain meaning, something you can take hold of, whereas usually I don't know whether I am making myself." "Bravo!" cried Settembrini. "Bravo, Lieutenant! You are describing very well indeed an aspect of music which has indubitably a moral value, namely, that her peculiarly life-enhancing method of measuring time imparts a spiritual awareness and value to its passage. Music quickens time. She quickens us to the finest enjoyment of time. She quickens, and in so far she has moral value. Art has moral value, in so far as it quickens. But what if it does the opposite? What if it dulls us, sends us to sleep, works against action and progress? Music can do that too. She is an old hand at using opiates. But the opiate, my dear sirs, is a gift of the devil. It makes for lethargy, inertia, slavish inaction, stagnation. There is something suspicious about music, gentlemen. I insist that she is, by her nature, equivocal. I shall not be going too far in saying at once that she is politically suspect." He went on in this vein, and Hans Castorp listened without precisely following, first on account of his fatigue, and second because his attention was distracted by the proceedings of the light-headed young folk on the steps. Did his eyes deceive him, or was the taper-faced girl really occupied in sewing on a button for the monocled youth, and, forsooth, on the knee-band of his knickerbockers? She breathed asthmatically as she sewed, and he coughed and carried his little finger, with the salt-spoon-shaped nail, to his mouth. Of course they were ill. But, after all, these young folk up here did have peculiar social standards. The band played a polka. Hip! Thus Sunday passed. The afternoon was marked by drives undertaken by various groups. Several times after tea a carriage and pair drove up the winding road and halted before the portal to receive its occupants, these being, for the most part, Russian ladies. "Russians drive a great deal," Joachim said to Hans Castorp, as they stood before the entrance and amused themselves with watching the carriages move off. "They will be going to Clavedel, or into the valley of the Fluela, or as far as Closters. Those are the usual objectives. We might have a drive too while you are up here if you like. But for the present, I think you have enough to do to get used to things, and don't require more diversion." To which Hans Castorp agreed. He had a cigarette in his mouth and his hands in his trouser pockets, and stood so to watch the lively little old Russian lady as she, with her lean grandniece and two other ladies, took their seats in a carriage. The ladies were Madame Chowchat and Marussia. Madame Chowchat had put on a thin dust cloak belted in at the back, but wore no hat. She sat down beside the old dame in the body of the carriage, while the two girls took their places behind. All four were in lively vein and chattered without stopping in their soft, spineless tongue. They chattered about the top of the carriage, which was hard for them all to get underneath, about the Russian comfits the great-aunt had brought for them to munch, in a little wooden box lined with cotton wool and lace paper, and was already handing round. Hans Castorp distinguished with interest Frau Chowchat's slightly husky voice. As always, whenever he set eyes on that heedless creature, the likeness reasserted itself which had puzzled him for a while and then been revealed in a dream. But Marussia's laugh, the expression of her round, brown eyes, staring childlike above the tiny handkerchief she held over her mouth, the full bosom, which was yet so ailing within, reminded him of something else, something which gave him a sudden thrill and made him glance cautiously at his cousin without turning his head. No, thank goodness, Joachim had not gone mottled like that other time. His lips were not so painfully compressed. But he was gazing at Marussia, and his bearing, the expression in his eyes, was anything but military. Indeed, that absorbed and yearning look could only have been characterized as typically civilian. However, he pulled himself quickly together and stole a glance at Hans Castorp, which the latter had only just time to avoid, by turning his own eyes away and staring up into the sky. He felt his heart give a sudden beat, without rhyme or reason, of its own accord, as it had taken to doing up here. The Sunday was not further remarkable, except perhaps for the meals, which, since they could not well be more abundant than they already were, displayed greater refinement in the menu. At luncheon there was a saupoudre of chicken, garnished with crayfish and stone cherries. With the ices came pastries served in baskets of spun sugar and fresh pineapple besides. In the evening, after he had drunk his beer, Hans Castorp felt heavier in the limbs and more chilled and exhausted than on the day before. Toward 9 o'clock he bade his cousin good night, drew his plumeau up to his chin, and slept like the dead. But next day, the first Monday spent by the guest up here, there came another regularly recurring variation in the daily routine, the lectures, one of which Dr. Krokowski delivered every other Monday morning in the dining room, before the entire adult population of the sanatorium, with exception of the moribund, and those who could not understand the language. The course, Hans Castorp learned from his cousin, consisted of a series of popular scientific lectures under the general title, Love as a Force Contributory to Disease. These instructive entertainments took place after second breakfast. It was not permissible, Joachim reiterated, to absent oneself from them, or, at least, absence was frowned upon. It was thus very daring of Settembrini, who surely must have more command of the language than anyone else, not only never to appear, but to refer to the entertainment in most disparaging terms. For Hans Castorp's part, he straightway resolved to be present, in the first place out of courtesy, but also with unconcealed curiosity as to what he should hear. Before the appointed hour, however, he did something quite perverse and ill-judged, which proved worse for him than one could possibly have guessed. He went out for a long, solitary walk. "Now listen to me," had been his first words, when Joachim entered his room that morning. "I can see that it can't go on with me like this. I've had enough of the horizontal for the present. One's very blood goes to sleep. Of course it is different with you. You are a patient, and I have no intention of tempting you. But I mean to take a proper walk after breakfast, if you don't mind, just walking at random for a couple of hours. I'll stick a little something in my pocket for second breakfast. Then I shall be independent. We shall see if I am not quite a different chap when I come back." Joachim warmly agreed, as he saw his cousin was in earnest in his desire and his project. "But don't overdo it," he said. "That's my advice. It's not the same thing up here as at home. And be sure to come back in time for the lecture." In reality, young Hans Castorp had more ground than the physical for his present resolve. His overheated head, the prevailing bad taste in his mouth, the fitful throbbing of his heart, were, or so he felt, less evil accompaniments to the process of acclimatization than such things as the goings-on of the Russian pair next door, the table talk of the stupid and afflicted Frau Store, the gentleman rider's pulpy cough daily heard in the corridor, the utterances of her Albin, the impression he received of the manners and morals of the ailing young folk about him, the expression on Joachim's face when he looked at Marussia. These and 100 observations more made him feel it would be good to escape a while from the Berghof circle, to breathe the air deep into his lungs, to get some proper exercise, and then, when he felt tired at night, he would at least know why. He took leave of Joachim in a spirit of enterprise, when his cousin addressed himself, after breakfast, to the usual round as far as the bench by the watercourse. Then, swinging his walking-stick, he took his own way down the road. It was about 9 o'clock of a cool morning, with a covered sky. According to program, Hans Castorp drew in deep draughts of the pure morning air, the fresh, light atmosphere that breathed in so easily, that held no hint of damp, that was without associations, without content. He crossed the stream and the narrow-gauge road to the street, with its scattered buildings, but left this again soon to strike into a meadow path, which went only a short way on the level and then slanted steeply up to the right. The climbing rejoiced Hans Castorp's heart. His chest expanded. He pushed his hat back on his forehead with the crook of his stick. Having gained some little height, he looked back, and, seeing in the distance the mirror-like lake he had passed on his journey hither, he began to sing. He sang what songs he had at his command, all kinds of sentimental folk ditties, out of collections of national ballads and student songbooks. One of them, that went. He sang at first softly, in a humming tone, then louder, finally at the top of his voice. His baritone lacked flexibility, yet today he found it good, and sang on with mounting enthusiasm. When he found he had pitched the beginning too high, he shifted into falsetto, and even that pleased him. When his memory left him in the lurch, he helped himself out by setting to the melody whatever words and syllables came to hand, heedless of the sense, giving them out like an operatic singer, with arching lips and strong palatal R. He even began to improvise both words and music, accompanying his performance with theatrical gesturings. It is a good deal of a strain to sing and climb at the same time, and Hans Castorp found his breath growing scant and scanter. Yet for sheer pleasure in the idea, for the joy of singing, he forced his voice and sang on, with frequent gasps for breath, until he could no more, and sank, quite out of wind, half blind, with colored sparks before his eyes and racing pulses, beneath a sturdy pine. His exultation gave way on the sudden to a pervading gloom. He fell a prey to dejection bordering on despair. When, his nerves being tolerably restored, he got to his feet again to continue his walk, he found his neck trembling. Indeed, his head shook in precisely the same way now, at his age, in which the head of old Hans Lorenz Castorp once had shaken. The phenomenon so freshly called up to him the memory of his dead grandfather that, far from finding it offensive, he took a certain pleasure in availing himself of that remembered and dignified method of supporting the chin, by means of which his grandfather had been wont to control the shaking of his head, and to which the boy had responded with such inward sympathy. He mounted still higher on the zigzag path, drawn by the sound of cowbells, and came at length upon the herd, grazing near a hut whose roof was weighted with stones. Two bearded men approached him, with axes on their shoulders. They parted, a little way off him, and, "Thank ye kindly, and God be with ye," said the one to the other, in a deep guttural voice, shifted his axe to the other shoulder, and began breaking a path through crackling pine boughs to the valley. The words sounded strange in this lonely spot. They came dreamlike to Hans Castorp's senses, strained and benumbed. He repeated them, softly, trying to reproduce the guttural, rustically formal syllables of the mountain tongue, as he climbed another stretch higher, above the hut. He had in mind to reach the height where the trees left off, but on glancing at his watch resisted. He took the left-hand path in the direction of the village. It ran level for some way, then led downhill, among tall-trunked pines, where, as he went, he once more began to sing, tentatively, and despite the fact that he felt his knees to tremble more than they had during the ascent. On issuing from the wood he paused, Struck by the charm of the small, enclosed landscape before him, a scene composed of elements both peaceful and sublime. A mountain stream came flowing in its shallow, stony bed down the right-hand slope, poured itself foaming over the terraced boulders lying in its path, then coursed more calmly toward the valley, crossed at this point by a picturesque railed wooden footbridge. The ground all about was blue, with the bell-like blossoms of a profusely growing, bushy plant. Somber fir trees of even, mighty growth stood in the bed of the ravine and climbed its sides to the height. One of them, rooted in the steep bank at the side of the torrent, thrust itself aslant into the picture, with bizarre effect. The whole remote and lovely spot was wrapped in a sounding solitude by the noise of the rushing waters. Hans Castorp remarked a bench that stood on the farther bank of the stream. He crossed the footbridge and sat down to regale himself with the sight of the foaming, rushing waterfall and the idyllic sound of its monotonous, yet modulated prattle. For Hans Castorp loved like music the sound of rushing water. Perhaps he loved it even more. But hardly had he settled himself when he was overtaken by a bleeding at the nose, which came on so suddenly he had barely time to save his clothing from soilure. The bleeding was violent and persistent, taking to stanch it nearly half an hour of going to and fro between bench and brook, snuffing water up his nostrils, rinsing his handkerchief, and lying flat on his back upon the wooden seat with the damp cloth on his nose. He lay there, after the blood at length was stanched, his knees elevated, hands folded behind his head, eyes closed, and ears full of the noise of water. He felt no unpleasant sensation. The bloodletting had had a soothing effect, but he found himself in a state of extraordinarily reduced vitality, so that when he exhaled the air, he felt no need to draw it in again, and lay there moveless, for the space of several quiet heartbeats, before taking another slow and superficial breath. Quite suddenly, he found himself in the far distant past, transported to a scene which had come back to him in a dream some nights before, summoned by certain impressions of the last few days. But so strongly, so resistlessly, to the annihilation of time and space, was he wrapped back into the past. One might have said it was a lifeless body lying here on the bench by the waterside, while the actual Hans Castorp moved in that faraway time and place, in a situation which was for him, despite its childishness, vibrant with daring and adventure. It happened when he was a lad of 13 in knee breeches in the lower third form at school. He stood in the schoolyard and talked with another boy of like years, from a higher form. The conversation had been begun, rather arbitrarily, by himself and, dealing as it did with a narrowly circumscribed subject of a practical nature, could in no case be prolonged, yet it gave him the greatest satisfaction. It took place in the break between the last two periods, a history and a drawing hour for Hans Castorp's form. The pupils were walking up and down, or standing about in groups, or lounging against the glazed abutments of the school building wall. A murmur of voices filled the red-tiled courtyard, which was shut off from the street by a wall topped with shingles and provided with 2 entrance gates. Supervision was exercised by a master in a slouch hat who munched a ham sandwich the while. He with whom Hans Castorp spoke was called Hip, Pribislav Hip. A peculiarity of this given name was that you were to pronounce it as though it were spelled Skibislav, and the singularity of the appellation suited the lad's appearance, which did indeed have something exotic about it. Hip was the son of a scholar and history professor in the gymnasium. He was, by consequence, a notorious model pupil, and, though not much older than Hans Castorp, already a form higher up. He came from Mecklenburg, and was in his person obviously the product of an ancient mixture of races, a grafting of Germanic stock with Slavic, or the reverse. True, his close-shorn round pate was blonde, but the eyes were a gray-blue, or a blue-gray, an indefinite, ambiguous color, like the hue of far-distant mountain ranges, and of an odd, narrow shape, were even, to be precise, a little slanting, with strongly marked, prominent cheekbones directly under them. It was a type of face which in this instance, far from seeming an abnormality, was distinctly pleasing, though odd enough to have won for him the nickname of the Kirghiz among his schoolmates. Hip already wore long trousers, and a blue jacket belted in at the back and close to the throat, the collar of which was usually whitened by a few scales of dandruff. Now, The thing was that Hans Castorp for a long time had his eye upon this Pribislav, had chosen him out of the whole host, known and unknown, in the courtyard of the school, taken an interest in him, followed him with his eyes, shall we say admired him, at all events observed him with peculiar sympathy. Even on the way to school, he looked forward with pleasure to watching him among his fellows, seeing him speak and laugh, singling out his voice from the others by its pleasantly veiled, husky quality. Granted that there is no sufficient ground for his preference, unless one might refer it to Hip's heathenish name, his character as model pupil, this latter was, of course, out of the question, or to the Kirghiz eyes, whose gray-blue glance could sometimes melt into a mystery of darkness when one caught it musing sidewise. Whichever it might be, or none of these, Hans Castorp troubled not a whit to justify his feelings, or even to question by what name they might suitably be called. For, since he did not know Hip, the relation could hardly be one of friendship. But in the first place there was not the faintest need of calling it anything. It could never be a subject of discussion. That would be out of place, and he had no desire for it. And, in the second, giving a thing a name implies, if not passing judgment on it, at least defining it, that is to say, classifying it among the familiar and habitual. Whereas Hans Castorp was penetrated by the unconscious conviction that an inward good of this sort was above all to be guarded from definition and classification. But whether well or ill-founded, and however far from being the subject of conversation, or even from being touched on in Hans Castorp's own mind, these feelings of his flourished there in great strength, as they had done for almost a year now, or a year as nearly as one could fix the time, for it was hard to be precise about their beginnings. For about a year, then, he had carried them about in secret, which spoke for the loyalty and constancy of his character, when one reflects what a great space of time a year is at that age. But alas, every characterization of this kind involves a moral judgment, whether favorable or unfavorable, though, to be sure, each trait of character has its two sides. Thus Hans Castorp's loyalty, upon which, be it said, he was not prone to plume himself, consisted, baldly, in a certain temperamental heaviness, sluggishness, and quiescence, a fundamental tendency to feel respect for conditions of duration and stability, and the more respect, the longer they lasted. He inclined to believe in the permanence of the particular state or circumstances in which he for the moment found himself, prized it for that very quality, and was not bent on change. Thus he had grown used to his silent and remote relation to Pribislav Hip, and considered it a regular feature of his life, loved the emotions it brought in its train, the suspense as to whether he was likely to meet him that day, whether Pribislav would pass close by him, even look at him, loved the subtle and wordless satisfaction imparted by his secret, loved even the disappointments inseparable from it, the greatest of which was Pribislav's absence from school. When this happened, the schoolyard became a desert. The day lacked all charm. Hope alone lingered. The affair had lasted a year, up to that intrepid and culminating moment, after which, thanks to Hans Castorp's constancy of spirit, it lasted another. Then it was over. And it is a fact that he marked no more the loosening and dissolving of the bond which united him to Pribislav than he had previously marked its beginnings. Moreover, in consequence of his father's taking another position, Pribislav left the school and the city, but that was all one to Hans Castorp. He had already forgotten him before he went. One may put it that the figure of the Kirghiz had glided out of the mist into Hans Castorp's life, and slowly grown vivid and tangible there, up to that moment of the greatest nearness and corporeity in the school court, had stood a while thus in the foreground, then slowly receded, and, with no pain of parting, dissolved again into the mist. But that moment, that bold, adventurous situation, into which Hans Castorp found himself transported after all these years, the conversation, an actual conversation with Pribislav Hip, came about thus. The drawing lesson was the next period, and Hans Castorp found himself without a pencil. His classmates needed their own, but he had among the other pupils this and that acquaintance, of whom he might have sought a loan. Yet he found it was Pribislav who after all stood nearest to him, with whom, in secret, he had to do, and with a joyous impulse of his entire being he determined to seize the opportunity, for so he called it, and ask Pribislav for a pencil. It was rather an odd thing to do, since he did not, in reality, know Pribislav at all, but this aspect of the affair escaped him in his recklessness, or he chose to disregard it. So there he stood before Pribislav Hip, among the bustling crowd that filled the tiled courtyard, and he said to him, "Excuse me, can you lend me a pencil?" And Pribislav looked at him, with his Kyrgyz eyes above the prominent cheekbones, and spoke, in his pleasantly husky voice, without any surprise, or, at least, without showing any. "With pleasure," he said, "but you must be sure to give it me back after the period," and drew his pencil out of his pocket, a silver pencil holder with a ring in the end, which one screwed in order to make the red lead pencil come out. He displayed the simple mechanism, their two heads bent over it together. "Only be careful not to break it," he added. What made him say that? As if Hans Castorp had been intending to handle it carelessly or keep it after the hour. They looked at each other and smiled. Then, as there remained nothing more to say, they turned, first their shoulders and then their backs, and went. That was all. But never in his life had Hans Castorp felt so supremely content as in this drawing hour, drawing with Pribislav Hip's pencil, in the immediate prospect of giving it back into the owner's hand, which followed as a matter of course out of what had gone before. He took the liberty of sharpening the pencil a little, and cherished 3 of the red shavings nearly a year, in an inner drawer of his desk. No one seeing them there could have guessed what significance they possessed. The return of the pencil was of the simplest formality, quite after Hans Castorp's heart. Indeed, he prided himself on it no little, in the vainglorious state his intimacy with Hip produced. "There," he said, "and thanks very much." And Pribislav said nothing at all, only hastily tried the screw and stuck the pencil in his pocket. Never again did they speak to each other, but this one time, thanks to the enterprise of Hans Castorp, they had spoken. He wrenched his eyes open, amazed at the depths of the trance in which he had been sunk. "I've been dreaming," he thought. Yes, that was Pribislav. It's a long time since I thought of him. I wonder what became of the shavings. My desk is in the attic at Uncle Teenapple's. They must be there yet, in the little inner back drawer. I never took them out, never thought enough about them to throw them away. That was certainly Pribislav, his very own self. I shouldn't have thought I could remember him so clearly. How remarkably like her he looked, like this girl up here. Is that why I feel interested in her? Or was that why I felt so interested in him? What rubbish. Anyhow, I must be stirring, and pretty fast, too. But he lay another moment, musing and recalling, before he got up. "Then thank ye kindly, and God be with ye," he said. The tears came to his eyes as he smiled. And with that he would have been off, but instead sat suddenly down again with his hat and stick in his hand, being forced to the realization that his knees would not support him. "Hello," he thought, "this won't do. I am supposed to be back in the dining room punctually at 11 for the lecture. Taking walks up here is very beautiful but appears to have its difficult side. Well, I can't stop here. I must have got stiff from lying. I shall be better as I move about." He tried again to get on his legs and, by dint of great effort, succeeded. But the return home was lamentable indeed, after the high spirits of his setting forth. He had repeatedly to rest by the way, feeling the color recede from his face and cold sweat break out on his brow. The wild beating of his heart took away his breath. Thus painfully he fought his way down the winding path and reached the bottom in the neighborhood of the courthouse. But here it became clear that his own powers would never take him over the stretch between him and the Berghof, and accordingly, as there was no tram and he saw no carriages for hire, he hailed a driver going toward the Dorf with a load of empty boxes and asked permission to climb into his wagon. Back to back with the man, his legs hanging down out of the end, swaying and nodding with fatigue and the jolting of the vehicle, regarded with surprise and sympathy by the passers-by, he got as far as the railway crossing, where he dismounted and paid for his ride, whether much money or little he did not heed, and hurried headlong up the drive. "Dépêchez-vous, monsieur," said to him the French concierge. "La conférence de M. Krokowski vient de commencer." Hans Castorp tossed hat and stick on the stand and squeezed himself with much precaution, tongue between his teeth, through the partly open glass door into the dining room, where the Society of the Cure sat in rows on their chairs, and on the right-hand narrow side of the room, behind a covered table adorned with a water bottle, Dr. Krokowski, in a frock coat, stood and delivered his lecture. Analysis. Luckily, there was a vacant seat in the corner, near the door. He slipped into it and assumed an air of having been here from the beginning. The audience, hanging rapt on Dr. Krokowski's lips, paid him no heed, which was as well, for he looked rather ghastly. His face white as a sheet, his coat spotted with blood. He might have been a murderer stealing from his crime. The lady in front of him did, indeed, turn her head as he sat down, and measured him with narrow eyes. With a sense of exasperation, he recognized Madame Chowchat. Deuce take it, was he never to have a moment's peace? He had thought that, having arrived at his goal, he could sit here quietly and rest a little, and now he had to have her under his nose. In other circumstances, he might conceivably have found her nearness rather pleasant than otherwise. But now, worn out and harassed as he felt, what was it to him? It could only make new demands on his heart and keep him from drawing a long breath during the whole lecture. With Pribyslav's very eyes she had looked at him, and at the spots of blood on his coat. Her look had been rather bold and ruthless too, as a woman's would be who let doors bang behind her. How badly she held herself. Not like the ladies of Hans Castorp's social sphere, who sat erect at their tables, turned their heads towards their lords and masters, and spoke with mincing correctness. Frau Chowchat sat all relaxed, with drooping shoulders and round back. She even thrust her head forward until the vertebra at the base of the neck showed prominently above the rounded décolletage of her white blouse. Pribyslav had held his head like that. But he had been a model pupil and full of honors, which was not the reason why Hans Castorp had borrowed his pencil, whereas it was abundantly clear that Frau Chowchat's bad carriage, her door slamming, and the directness of her gaze all had to do with her physical condition. Yes, were even expressive of that want of restraint in which young Herr Albin rejoiced, which was not honorable at all, yet possessed boundless advantages all its own. Hans Castorp's thoughts, as he sat and looked at Frau Chowchat's flaccid back, began to blur. They ceased to be thoughts at all, and began to be a reverie, into which Dr. Krokowski's drawling baritone, with a soft-sounding R, came as from afar. But the stillness of the room, the profound attention that wrapped all the rest of the audience, had the effect of rousing him too. He looked about. Near him sat the thin-haired pianist, with bent head and folded arms, listening with his mouth open. Somewhat farther on was Fräulein Engelhardt, avid-eyed, with a dull red spot on each cheek. Hans Castorp saw the same signal flame on the faces of other ladies, on Frau Salomons and Frau Magnus, the same who was wife to the brewer and lost flesh persistently. Frau Storr sat somewhat farther back, an expression of ignorant credulity painted on her face, truly painful to behold, while the ivory-complexioned Levi, leaning back in her chair with half-closed eyes, her hands lying open in her lap, would have looked like a corpse had not her breast risen and fallen with such profound and rhythmical breaths as to remind Hans Castorp of a mechanical waxwork he had once seen. Many of the guests had their hands curved behind their ears. Some even held the hand in the air halfway thither, as though arrested midway in the gesture by the strength of their concentration. Lawyer Paravant, a sunburnt man who looked to have had the strength of a bull, even flicked his ear with his forefinger to make it hear better, then turned it again to catch the words that flowed from Dr. Krokowski's lips. And what was Dr. Krokowski saying? What was his line of thought? Hans Castorp summoned his wits to discover, not immediately succeeding, however, since he had not heard the beginning and lost still more while musing on Frau Chowchat's flabby back. It was about a power, the power which, in short, it was about the power of love. Yes, of course. The subject was already given out in the general title of the whole course, and moreover, this was Dr. Krokowski's special field. Of what else should he be talking? It was a bit odd, to be sure, listening to a lecture on such a theme, when previously Hans Castorp's courses had dealt only with such matters as geared transmission and shipbuilding. No, really, how did one go about to discuss a subject of this delicate and private nature, in broad daylight, before a mixed audience? Dr. Krokowski did it by adopting a mingled terminology, partly poetic and partly erudite, ruthlessly scientific, yet with a vibrating, sing-song delivery, which impressed young Hans Castorp as being unsuitable, but may have been the reason why the ladies looked flushed and the gentlemen flicked their ears to make them hear better. In particular, the speaker employed the word love in a somewhat ambiguous sense, so that you were never quite sure where you were with it, or whether he had reference to its sacred or its passionate and fleshly aspect, and this doubt gave one a slightly seasick feeling. Never in all his life had Hans Castorp heard the word uttered so many times on end as he was hearing it now. When he reflected, it seemed to him he had never taken it in his own mouth, nor ever heard it from a stranger's. That might not be the case, but whether it were or no, the word did not seem to him to repay such frequent repetition. The slippery monosyllable, with its lingual and labial, and the bleeding vowel between, it came to sound positively offensive. It suggested watered milk, or anything else that was pale and insipid, the more so considering the meat for strong men Dr. Krokowski was in fact serving up. For it was plain that when one said about it like that, one could go pretty far without shocking anybody. He was not content to allude, with exquisite tact, to certain matters which are known to everybody, but which most people are content to pass over in silence. He demolished illusions. He was ruthlessly enlightened. He relentlessly destroyed all faith in the dignity of silver hairs and the innocence of the sucking babe. And he wore, with the frock coat, his negligee collar, sandals, and gray woolen socks, and, thus attired, made an impression profoundly otherworldly, though at the same time not a little startling to young Hans Castorp. He supported his statements with a wealth of illustration and anecdote from the books and loose notes on the table before him. Several times he even quoted poetry. And he discussed certain startling manifestations of the power of love, certain extraordinary, painful, uncanny variations, which the majestic phenomenon at times displayed. It was, he said, the most unstable, the most unreliable of man's instincts, the most prone of its very essence to error and fatal perversion, in the which there was nothing that should cause surprise. For this mighty force did not consist of a single impulse, it was of its nature complex. It was built up out of components which, however legitimate they might be in composition, were, taken each by itself, sheer perversity. But, continued Dr. Krokowski, since we refuse, and rightly, to deduce the perversity of the whole from the perversity of its parts, we are driven to claim, for the component perversities, some part at least, though perhaps not all, of the justification which attaches to their united product. We were driven by sheer force of logic to this conclusion. Dr. Krokowski implored his hearers, having arrived at it, to hold it fast. Now there were psychical correctives, forces working in the other direction, instincts tending to conformability and regularity. He would almost have liked to characterize them as bourgeois, and these influences had the effect of merging the perverse components into a valid and irreproachable whole, a frequent and gratifying result, which, Dr. Krokowski almost contemptuously added, was, as such, of no further concern to the thinker and the physician. But on the other hand, there were cases where this result was not obtained, could not and should not be obtained, and who, Dr. Krokowski asked, would dare to say that these cases did not, psychically considered, form a higher, more exclusive type? For in these cases the two opposing groups of instincts, the compulsive force of love, and the sum of the impulses urging in the other direction, among which he would particularly mention shame and disgust, both exhibited an extraordinary and abnormal height and intensity when measured by the ordinary bourgeois standards. And the conflict between them which took place in the abysses of the soul prevented the erring instinct from attaining to that safe, sheltered, and civilized state which alone could resolve its difficulties in the prescribed harmonies of the love life as experienced by the average human being. This conflict between the powers of love and chastity, for that was what it really amounted to, what was its issue? It ended, apparently, in the triumph of chastity. Love was suppressed, held in darkness and chains by fear, conventionality, aversion, or a tremulous yearning to be pure. Her confused and tumultuous claims were never allowed to rise to consciousness or to come to proof in anything like their entire strength or multiformity. But this triumph of chastity was only an apparent, a Pyrrhic victory, for the claims of love could not be crippled or enforced by any such means. The love thus suppressed was not dead. It lived. It labored after fulfillment in the darkest and secretest depths of the being. It would break through the ban of chastity. It would emerge, if in a form so altered as to be unrecognizable. But what then was this form, this mask, in which suppressed, unchartered love would reappear? Dr. Krokowski asked the question and looked along the listening rows as though in all seriousness expecting an answer. But he had to say it himself, who had said so much else already. No one knew save him, but it was plain that he did. Indeed, with his ardent eyes, his black beard setting off the waxen pallor of his face, his monkish sandals and gray woolen socks, he seemed to symbolize in his own person that conflict between passion and chastity which was his theme. At least so thought Hans Castorp, as with the others he waited in the greatest suspense to hear in what form love driven below the surface would reappear. The ladies barely breathed. Lawyer Paravant rattled his ear anew, that the critical moment might find it open and receptive. And Dr. Krokowski answered his own question, and said, "In the form of illness. Symptoms of disease are nothing but a disguised manifestation of the power of love, and all disease is only love transformed." So now they knew, though very probably not all of them were capable of an opinion on what they heard. A sigh passed through the assemblage, and Lawyer Paravant weightily nodded approbation as Krokowski proceeded to develop his theme. Hans Castorp for his part sat with bowed head, trying to reflect on what had been said and test his own understanding of it. But he was unpracticed in such exercises, and rendered still further incapable of mental exertion by the unhappy effect of the walk he had taken. His thoughts were soon drawn off again by the sight of Frau Chauchat's back, and the arm appertaining, which was lifting and bending itself, close before Hans Castorp's eyes, so that the hand could hold the braids of hair. It made him uncomfortable to have the hand so close beneath his eye, to be forced to look at it whether he wished or no, to study it in all its human blemishes and imperfections, as though under a magnifying glass. No, there was nothing aristocratic about this stubby schoolgirl hand, with the badly cut nails. He was even not quite sure that the ends of the fingers were perfectly clean, and the skin round the nails was distinctly bitten. Hans Castorp made a face, but his eyes remained fixed on Madame Chauchat's back, as he vaguely recalled what Dr. Krokowski had been saying about counteracting influences of a bourgeois kind, which set themselves up against the power of love. The arm, in its gentle upward curve, was better than the hand. It was scarcely clothed, for the material of the sleeve was thinner than that of the blouse, being the lightest gauze, which had the effect of lending the arm a sort of shadowed radiance, making it prettier than it might otherwise have been. It was at once both full and slender, in all probability cool to the touch. No, so far as the arm went, the idea about counteracting bourgeois influences did not apply. Hans Castorp mused, his gaze still bent on Frau Chauchat's arm. The way women dressed. They showed their necks and bosoms. They transfigured their arms by veiling them in illusion. They did so, the world over, to arouse our desire. Oh God, how beautiful life was! And it was just such accepted commonplaces as this that made it beautiful, for it was a commonplace that women dressed themselves alluringly. It was so well known and recognized a fact that we never consciously realized it, but merely enjoyed it without a thought. And yet he had an inward conviction that we ought to think about it, ought to realize what a blessed, what a well-nigh miraculous arrangement it was. For of course it all had a certain end and aim. It was by a definite design that women were permitted to array themselves with irresistible allure. It was for the sake of posterity, for the perpetuation of the species. Of course. But suppose a woman were inwardly diseased, unfit for motherhood. What then? What was the sense of her wearing gauze sleeves and attracting male attention to her physical parts if these were actually unsound? Obviously, there was no sense. It ought to be considered immoral, and forbidden as such. For a man to take an interest in a woman inwardly diseased had no more sense than the interest Hans Castorp had once taken in Pribislav Hip. The comparison was a stupid one. It roused memories better forgotten. He had not meant to make it. It came into his head unbidden. But at this point his musings broke off, largely because Dr. Krokowski had raised his voice and so drawn attention once more upon himself. He was standing there behind his table, with his arms outstretched and his head on one side. Almost, despite the frock coat, he looked like Christ on the cross. It seemed that at the end of his lecture Dr. Krokowski was making propaganda for psychoanalysis. With open arms he summoned all and sundry to come unto him. "Come unto me," he was saying, though not in those words. "Come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden." And he left no doubt of his conviction that all those present were weary and heavy laden. He spoke of secret suffering, of shame and sorrow, of the redeeming power of the analytic. He advocated the bringing of light into the unconscious mind and explained how the abnormality was metamorphosed into the conscious emotion. He urged them to have confidence. He promised relief. Then he let fall his arms, raised his head, gathered up his notes, and went out by the corridor door, with his head in the air and the bundle of papers held schoolmaster fashion in his left hand, against his shoulder. His audience rose, pushed back its chairs, and slowly began to move towards the same door, as though converging upon him from all sides, without volition, hesitatingly, yet with one accord, like the throng after the Pied Piper. Hans Castorp stood in the stream without moving, his hand on the back of his chair. "I am only a guest up here," he thought. "Thank God I am healthy. That business has nothing to do with me. I shan't even be here for the next lecture." He watched Frau Chauchat going out, gliding along with her head thrust forward. Did she have herself psychoanalyzed, he wondered, and his heart began to thump. He did not notice Joachim coming toward him among the chairs, and started when his cousin spoke. "You got here at the last minute," Joachim said. "Did you go very far? How was it?" "Oh, very nice," Hans Castorp answered. "Yes, I went rather a long way. But I must confess, it did me less good than I thought it would. I won't repeat it for the present." Joachim did not ask how he liked the lecture, neither did Hans Castorp express an opinion. By common consent they let the subject rest, both then and thereafter. Doubts and considerations. Tuesday was the last day of our hero's week up here, and accordingly he found his weekly bill in his room on his return from the morning walk. It was a clear and businesslike document, in a green envelope, with a picture of the Berghof building at the top, and extracts from the prospectus carried in a narrow column down the left-hand side of the sheet. Psychoanalytic treatment by the most modern methods was called attention to by means of space type. The items, set down in a calligraphic hand, came to 180 francs almost exactly, 8 francs a day for his chamber, 12 for board and medical attendance, entrance fee 20, disinfection of room 10, while small charges for laundry, beer, and the late dinner of the first evening made up the sum. Hans Castorp went over the bill with Joachim and found naught to object to. "Of course I made no use of the medical attendance," he said, "but that was my own affair. It is included in the price of pension, and I couldn't expect them to make any deduction. How could they? As regards the disinfection, they must show a neat profit there. They never could have used 10 francs worth of H2CO to smoke the American woman out. But on the whole I must say I find it cheap rather than dear, considering what they offer." And before second breakfast, they went down to the management in order that Hans Castorp might acquit himself of his debt. The management was on the ground floor. You reached it after passing the hall, the garderobe, the kitchens, and domestic offices. You could not miss the door. It had a porcelain shield. Hans Castorp took an interest in this glimpse into the business side of the enterprise. There was a neat little office, with a typist busy at her machine, and 3 clerks bending over desks. In an adjoining office a man who looked like a head or director was working at a desk in the middle of the room. He flung a cool and calculating glance at the clients over the top of his glasses. Their affair was dispatched at the cashier's window, a note changed, money received, the bill receipted, the cousins preserving throughout these transactions the solemn, discreet, almost overawed bearing which the young German's respect for authority leads him to assume in the presence of pens, ink, and paper, or anything else which bears to his mind an official stamp. But on the way to breakfast, and later in the course of the day, they talked about the direction of the Berghof sanatorium, and Joachim, in his character as inmate, answered his cousin's questions. Hofrat Behrens was not, though he gave the impression of being, owner and proprietor of the establishment. Above and behind him stood invisible powers, which to a certain extent manifested their existence in the office they had just visited. They consisted of a supervisory head and a stock company, in which it was not a bad thing to hold shares, according to Joachim, since the members of it divided a fat dividend each year. The Hofrat was a dependent. He was merely an agent, a functionary, an associate of higher powers, the first and highest, of course, and the soul of the enterprise, with a well-defined influence upon it and upon the management itself, though, of course, as directing physician, he was relieved of all preoccupation with the business side. He was a native of northwestern Germany, and it was common knowledge that when he took the position, years ago, he had done so contrary to his previous intention and plans. He had come here on account of his wife, whose remains had long reposed in the village churchyard, that picturesque churchyard of Dorf Davos, which lay high up on the right-hand slope, nearer the entrance of the valley. She had been a charming person, to judge from her likenesses, though too large-eyed and aesthetic-looking. Photographs of her stood about everywhere in the Hofrat's house. Even oil portraits by his own amateur hand hung on the walls. 2 children, a son and a daughter, had been born. Then they had brought her up here, the fragile body already fever-smitten. A few months had seen the completion of the wasting-away process. Behrens, they said, had adored her. He was brought so low by the blow that he got very odd and melancholy. People saw him gesturing, sniggering, and talking to himself on the street. He did not go back to his original place, but remained where he was, in part, no doubt, because he could not tear himself away from her grave, but also for the less sentimental reason that he was himself in poor health and, in his own professional opinion, actually belonged here. He had settled down as one of the physicians who are companions in suffering to the patients in their care, who do not stand above disease, fighting her in the armor of personal security, but who themselves bear her mark, an odd, but by no means isolated, case, and one which has its good as well as its bad side. Sympathy between doctor and patient is surely desirable, and a case might be made out for the view that only he who suffers can be the guide and healer of the suffering. And yet, can true spiritual mastery over a power be won by him who is counted among her slaves? Can he free others who himself is not free? The ailing physician remains a paradox to the average mind, a questionable phenomenon. May not his scientific knowledge tend to be clouded and confused by his own participation, rather than enriched and morally reinforced? He cannot face disease in clear-eyed hostility to her. He is a prejudiced party. His position is equivocal. With all due reserve, it must be asked whether a man who himself belongs among the ailing can give himself to the cure or care of others, as can a man who is himself entirely sound. Hans Castorp expressed some of these doubts and speculations, as he and Joachim gossiped about the Berghof and its professional head. But Joachim answered that nobody knew whether the Hofrat was still a patient. He was probably long since cured. It was ages ago that he had first begun to practice here, independently at first, and early winning a name for himself as an extraordinarily gifted auscultator and skillful surgeon. Then the Berghof had secured him. It would soon be 10 years that he had been in intimate association with it. His private residence was in the end of the northwest wing of the building. Dr. Krokowski's was not far off, and that lady of the lofty lineage, the nursing sister and directress of the establishment, of whom Settembrini had made such utter fun, and whom thus far Hans Castorp had scarcely seen, presided over the small household. The Hofrat was otherwise alone, for his son was at the university and his daughter already married, to a lawyer in one of the French cantons. Young Behrens sometimes visited his father in the holidays. He had done so once during Joachim's time up here. The ladies, he related, had been quite thrilled. Their temperatures had gone up. Petty jealousies had led to bickering and quarrels in the rest hall, and an increase of visits to Dr. Krokowski's private office. The assistant had his own office hours, in a special room, which, together with the large examination rooms, the laboratory, the operating rooms, and X-ray studio, was in the well-lighted basement of the building. We call it the basement, for the stone steps leading down to it from the ground floor created the impression that it was such an erroneous impression, for not only was the ground floor somewhat elevated, but the entire building stood on a side hill, partway up the mountain, and these basement rooms faced the front, with a view of the gardens and valley, a circumstance negatived to some extent by the fact of the steps leading down to them. One descended, as one supposed, from the ground floor, only to find oneself at the bottom still on it, or practically so. Hans Castorp amused himself with this illusion when he accompanied his cousin one afternoon down to the bathing master, that Joachim might get himself weighed. A clinical brilliance and spotlessness reigned in this sphere. Everything was as white. The doors gleamed with white enamel. The one leading to Dr. Krokowski's receiving room, with the doctor's visiting card tacked on it, was reached by 2 more steps down from the corridor, which gave the room behind it an air of being more spacious and withdrawn than the rest. This door was at the end of the corridor, on your right as you came downstairs. Hans Castorp kept his eye on it as he walked up and down waiting for his cousin. He saw a lady come out, a recent arrival, whose name he did not know, a small, dainty person, with curls on her forehead and gold earrings. She bent over as she mounted the stairs and held up her frock with one baringed hand, while with the other she pressed her tiny handkerchief to her lips and, all stooped as she was, stared up over it into nothing, with great blue, distracted eyes. She hurried with small tripping steps, her petticoat rustling, to the stairs, paused suddenly as though something had occurred to her, then went on tripping upward and disappeared, still bending over and holding her handkerchief to her mouth. Behind her, when she opened the office door, it had been much darker than in the white corridor. Obviously, the brilliant lighting of these lower regions did not extend so far. Hans Castorp remarked that a shadowed dusk, a profound twilight, prevailed in Dr. Krokowski's private sanctum. Table talk. Young Hans Castorp noticed that the ancestral tremor brought on by his ill-advised walk continued to trouble him. He found it rather an embarrassment when in the dining room. Almost as a regular thing now, his head would begin shaking at table. He found this impossible to prevent and hard to dissemble. He tried various devices to disguise the weakness, for he could not continually support his chin on his collar. He would keep his head in action, turning it to the right and left in conversation, or bear hard against the table with the left forearm when he carried a spoonful of soup to his mouth, and support his head with his hand. In the pauses he even rested his elbow on the table, this although it was in his own eyes a piece of ill-breeding, which would not pass in any society save the lax abnormal one where he now found himself. But the weakness was burdensome too, and went far to spoil the meal hours for him, which he had otherwise continued to find diverting and full of interesting episode. But the truth was, and Hans Castorp was entirely aware of it, that the absurd manifestation against which he struggled was not solely physical in its origin, not wholly to be accounted for by the air up here and the efforts his system made to adjust itself. Rather was it the outward expression of his inner stimulation, and bore directly upon those very episodes and diversions. Madame Chowchat almost invariably came late to meals. Until she came, Hans Castorp could not sit and keep his feet still, but must wait in suspense for the crashing of the glass door. He knew it would make him start, and that his face would feel cold all over, and this was what regularly happened. At first, he had jerked round his head infuriated and followed the offender with angry eyes to her seat at the good Russian table. He may even have muttered some abusive epithet between his teeth, some outraged cry of protest. But now he only bent over his plate, bit his lips, or deliberately turned his head away. It seemed to him that anger was no longer in place. He even had an obscure feeling that he was partly responsible, that he shared the blame with her before the others. In short, it would be no longer so true to say he was ashamed of Frau Chowchat as that he was ashamed for her, a feeling he might well have spared himself, for not a soul in the room troubled either over Frau Chowchat's misconduct or Hans Castorp's sensitiveness to it, with the possible exception of the schoolmistress, Fräulein Engelhardt, on his right. This poor creature had perceived that, thanks to his sensibility in the matter of slamming doors, a certain emotional attitude toward the Russian lady was come to subsist in her young neighbor's mind. Further, that the grounds of the attitude were of little moment compared to the fact of its existence, and, finally, that his assumed indifference, very poorly assumed, for Hans Castorp had neither talent nor training as an actor, did not mean a decrease of interest, but on the contrary indicated that the affair was passing into a higher phase. Fräulein Engelhardt was for her own person quite without hopes or pretensions. She therefore launched out into extravagant enthusiasm over Frau Chauchat, about which quite the most extraordinary thing was that Hans Castorp saw perfectly how she was egging him on, not all at once, perhaps, but in the course of time, saw through it and even felt disgusted at it, yet without being the less willingly led on by her and made a fool of. Slam bang, the old spinster said. That was she. No need to look up to tell who just came in. Of course, there she goes, like a kitten to a saucer of milk. How pretty it is. I wish we might change places, so you could look at her as much as you liked. Naturally, you don't care to keep turning your head. That would flatter her far too much. She is greeting her table. You really ought to look. It is so refreshing to see her. When she smiles and talks as she is doing now, a dimple comes in one cheek, but not always, only when she likes. What a love of a woman! A spoilt child. That is why she is so heedless. Creatures like that one is to love, whether one will or no. They vex you with their heedlessness, but that is only one reason the more for loving them. It makes you so happy to have to care for them in spite of yourself. She whispered on, behind her hand, for his ear alone. The flush that mantled on her downy old cheek bespoke a rising temperature, and the suggestiveness of her talk pierced Hans Castorp to the very marrow. It did him good to hear someone else confirm his view that Madame Chauchat was an enchanting creature. He was a young man of not very independent judgments, and glad to be encouraged in certain feelings he had, upon which both reason and conscience united to frown. But Fräulein Engelhardt, however much she would have liked to, could tell him practically nothing about Frau Chauchat. She knew no more than the whole sanatorium knew, and his conversations with her bore little practical fruit. She did not even know the lady to speak to, nor could she boast a single common acquaintance. Her only title to importance was that she lived in Königsberg, not very far from the Russian border, also that she knew a few scraps of Russian. These were but meager distinctions, yet Hans Castorp was prepared to see in them something resembling an extensive personal connection with Frau Chauchat. I see that she wears no ring, no wedding ring, he said. Why is that? She is a married woman. I think you told me? The schoolmistress was quite perturbed. She seemed to feel driven into a corner and sought for words to talk herself out again. So very responsible did she feel for Frau Chauchat. You must not attach importance to that, she finally said. I'm positive she is married. There is no doubt of it. Of course I know some foreigners do use the madam when they are getting a little on in years, for the sake of the greater respect people pay a married woman. But it is not the case here. Everyone knows she really has a husband, somewhere in Russia. Her maiden name was not French but Russian, something in Anau or Yukov. I did know it, but I have forgotten. I will ask if you like. There must be several people here who know it. No, she wears no ring. I have noticed it myself. Dear me, perhaps she finds it makes her hand look too broad. Or she thinks it is too bourgeois and domestic to wear a plain gold wedding ring. She might as well carry a key basket. No, she is built on broader lines than that. Russian women all have something free and large about them. And then, a wedding ring seems so prosaic, it is almost repellent. It is a symbol of possession. It is always saying, hands off. It turns every woman into a nun. I should not be at all surprised if that is what Frau Chauchat thinks. A charming woman like her. In the bloom of youth, why should she, every time she gives a man her hand to kiss, tell him straightway that she is bound in wedlock? Good Lord, thought Hans Castorp, how she does run on. He looked into her face, quite alarmed. But she countered his gaze with her embarrassed, half-frightened one. They were both silent a while, and sought to recover themselves. Hans Castorp ate his luncheon and supported his chin. At length he said, And her husband? He doesn't trouble himself about her? Does he never visit her up here? Do you know what he does? Official. Russian government official, in some distant province, Dagestan, out beyond the Caucasus, he was ordered there. No, as I tell you, no one has ever seen him up here. And this time she has been here going on 3 months. She was here before then? This is the 3rd time. And between times she goes to other places, other sanatoriums. But it is she who sometimes visits him. Not often, once in the year for a little while. One may say they live separated, and she visits him now and again. Well, of course, she is ill. Yes, of course, but not so ill. Not so ill as to have to live all her life in sanatoriums and apart from her husband. There must be other reasons for that. Everyone up here thinks there must be other reasons. Perhaps she does not like to live out there in Dagestan, the other side of the Caucasus. It would not be strange, such a wild, remote place. But there must be something about the man, too, if she can't bear to be with him. He has a French name, but after all he is a Russian official, and that is a very rough type, I do assure you. I once saw one of them, with an iron-gray beard and a red face. They are all frightfully corrupt, too, and drink quantities of vodka, They will eat a little something, for the look of the thing, a mushroom marine, some caviar, and then drink out of all measure and call it a light lunch. You are putting everything off on him, Hans Castorp said. But we can't know if the responsibility is not hers, of their not living together. One ought to be just. When I look at her and see the unmannerly way she behaves about the door, I assure you she's no angel. Excuse me for saying so. I wouldn't trust her across the street. But you are so partial. You are blinded by prejudice in her favor. This was the line he sometimes took. With a cunning otherwise foreign to his nature, he would make out that the schoolmistress's ravings over Madame Chowchat were not what he very well knew them to be, but an independent phenomenon, of a quaint and amusing kind, about which he, Hans Castorp, made free to tease the old spinster, feeling his own withers unwrung. He risked nothing by this attitude, being confident that his accomplice would agree to anything he said, no matter how wide of the mark. "Good morning," he greeted her. "I hope you slept well and dreamed of your charmer? Mistress Mary, quite contrary, or whatever her name is. Upon my word, one has only to speak of her to make you blush. You have completely lost your head over her. You can't deny it." And the schoolmistress, who really had blushed and tucked her head down over her cup, would mumble out of the left-hand corner of her mouth, "Shame on you, Herr Castorp. It really is too bad of you to embarrass me like this. Everyone can see we are talking about her, and that you have said something to make me get red." It was an extraordinary game the two of them were playing, each perfectly aware that they lied and double-lied, each knowing that Hans Castorp teased the schoolmistress only in order to be able to talk about Frau Chowchat. He took a morbid and extravagant pleasure in thus trifling with Fräulein Engelhardt, and she on her side reciprocated, first out of a natural instinct to be the go-between in a love affair, secondly, because to oblige Hans Castorp she had actually contrived to fall victim to Frau Chowchat's charms, and finally, because she felt a pathetic joy in having him tease her and make her blush. He well knew, and she well knew, all this about each other and themselves. Each knew that the other knew, and that the whole situation was equivocal and almost questionable. Equivocal and questionable situations were, in general, repugnant to Hans Castorp's taste, and the present one was no exception. He felt disgusted, yet for all that he went on fishing in these troubled waters, quieting his conscience with the assurance that he was only up here on a visit and would soon be leaving. He pronounced upon the young woman's charms with the air of a connoisseur, said she was sloppy, that she looked younger and prettier full-face than profile, that her eyes were too far apart, that she carried herself in a way that left much to be desired, that her arms, on the other hand, were pretty and soft-looking. He felt his head shaking as he talked. He tried to suppress the trembling, and realized not only that the schoolmistress must see his efforts, but, with profound disgust, that her head was actually shaking too. But he went on. He had purposely called Frau Chowchat Mistress Mary, in order that he might put the question of her name. So now he said, "I suppose her name is not Mary at all. Do you know what it is? I mean her given name. You must know it, being as much smitten as you are." The schoolmistress reflected. "Wait half a minute," she said. "I knew it once. Was it Tatiana?" No, nor Natasha. Natasha Chowchat? No, that was not it. Wait, I have it. It was Avdosha. Or at least something very like that. It was not Katienka or Ninotchka, of that I am certain. I can't quite get it for the moment. But I can surely recall it if you would like to know. And next day she actually did know the name, and uttered it the moment the glass door slammed. Frau Chauchat's name was Claudia. Hans Castorp did not grasp it at first. He had to have her repeat the name, even to spell it, before he understood. Then he pronounced it twice or thrice, turning his bloodshot eyes in Frau Chauchat's direction, in order, as it were, to try if it suited. Claudia, he said. Yes, that is probably it. It fits her quite well. He could not hide his pleasure in the degree of intimacy thus achieved, and from now on referred always to Frau Chauchat as Claudia. Your Claudia appears to be making bread pills. That's not very elegant, I should think. It depends on who does it, the schoolmistress would answer. Claudia it becomes. Yes, unquestionably the mealtimes in the hall with the 7 tables had great charm for Hans Castorp. He hated to have one come to an end, and his consolation was that soon, in 2 or 3 hours, he would be back again. While he was sitting there, it was as though he had never risen. And for the time in between, it was nothing. A short turn as far as the watercourse or the Platz, a little rest on his balcony. No great burden, no serious interruption. Not as though he had to look forward to some interest or effort, which would not have been so easy to overleap in spirit. Effort was not the rule in the well-regulated Berghof life. Hans Castorp, when he rose from one meal, could straightway by anticipation begin to rejoice in the next, if, indeed, rejoicing is not too facile, too pleasant and unequivocal a word for the sentiments with which he looked forward to another meeting with the afflicted fair one. The reader, on the other hand, may very likely find such adjectives the only ones suitable to describe Hans Castorp's personality or emotions. But we suggest that a young man with a well-regulated conscience and sense of fitness could not, whatever else he did, simply rejoice in Frau Chauchat's proximity. In fact, we, who must surely know, are willing to assert that he himself would have repudiated any such expression if it had been suggested to him. It is a small detail, yet worthy of mention, that he was growing to have a contempt for certain ways of expressing himself. He went about with that dry flush on his face and hummed continually under his breath, being in a state of mind when music particularly appeals. He hummed a ditty heard he knew not where, in some evening company or charity concert, sung by some thread of a soprano voice. It turned up now in his memory, a soft nothing, that went. He was about to go on, but broke off instead, with a disdainful shrug. Idiotic, he said, suddenly finding the tender ditty altogether tasteless, wishy-washy, and sentimental. He put it from him with manly sobriety, almost with regret. It was the sort of thing to satisfy a young man who had given his heart, as we say, given it wholly, legitimately, and with quite definite intentions, to some healthy little goose in the flatland, and thus might be justified in abandoning himself to his orthodox and gratifying sensations, with all the consequences they entailed. But for him and for his relations with Madame Chauchat, we are not responsible for the word relations. It was the word Hans Castorp used, not we. Such songs had nothing to do with them. Silly, he said sententiously, and put his nose in the air. But after pronouncing this aesthetic judgment, he lay silent in his deck chair, not thinking of anything more suitable to sing in its place. One thing there was which pleased him. When he lay listening to the beating of his heart, his corporeal organ, so plainly audible in the ordered silence of the rest period, throbbing loud and peremptorily, as it had done almost ever since he came, the sound no longer annoyed him. For now he need not feel that it so beat of its own accord, without sense or reason or any reference to his non-corporeal part. He could say, without stretching the truth, that such a connection now existed, or was easily induced. He was aware that he felt an emotion to correspond with the action of his heart. He needed only to think of Madame Chauchat, and he did think of her, and lo, he felt within himself the emotion proper to the heartbeats. Mounting misgivings of the 2 grandfathers and the boat ride in the twilight. The weather was vile. In this respect Hans Castorp had no luck during the brief term of his visit. It did not snow, but rained all day long, a hateful downpour. Thick mist wrapped the valley, while electric storms, an absurd and uncalled-for phenomenon, considering it was so cold that the heat had been turned on, rolled and reverberated disagreeably through the valley. "Too bad," Joachim said. "I thought we might take our luncheons and climb up to the Swiss Alps or something like that. But it seems it is not to happen. Let us hope the last week will be better." But Hans Castorp answered, "Let be. I am not so anxious to undertake anything for the moment. My first excursion was no great success. I find it does me more good just to take the day as it comes, without too much variation. I leave that sort of thing to people who have been up here for years. What do I want of variety in my 3 weeks' time?" He did, indeed, find his time well taken up, just as he was. Whatever his hopes, they would come to fruition, or else they would not, here on the spot and not on any Swiss Alp. Time did not hang heavy on his hands. Rather, he began to feel the end of his stay approach all too near. The second week was passing. Soon 2/3 of his holiday would be gone. The third week would no sooner begin than it would be time to think of packing. The refreshment of his sense of time was long since a thing of the past. The days rushed on. Yes, in the mass they rushed on, though at the same time each single day stretched out long and longer to hold the crowded, secret hopes and fears that filled it to overflowing. Time is a riddling thing, and hard it is to expound its essence. Must we put plainer name to those inward experiences which at once both waited and gave wings to Hans Castorp's days? We all know them. Their emotional inanity ran true to type. They would have taken no different course even had their origin been such as to make applicable the silly song on which he had pronounced his severe aesthetic judgment. Impossible that Madame Chowchat should know nothing of the threads that were weaving between her and a certain table. Indeed, Hans Castorp definitely, willfully purposed that she should know something, or even a good deal. We say willfully because his eyes were open. He was aware that reason and good sense were against it. But when a man is in Hans Castorp's state, or the state he was beginning to be in, he longs, above all, to have her of whom he dreams aware that he dreams, let reason and common sense say what they like to the contrary. Thus are we made. So, after it had happened twice or thrice that Madame Chowchat, impelled by chance or magnetic attraction, had turned and looked in the direction of Hans Castorp's table and met each time his eyes fixed upon her, she turned the fourth time with intent, and met them again. On the fifth occasion she did not catch him in flagrante. He was not at his post. Yet he straightway felt her eyes upon him, turned, and gazed so ardently that she smiled and looked away. Rapture and misgiving filled him at sight of that smile. Did she take him for a child? Very well, she should see. He cast about for means to refine upon the position. On the sixth occasion, when he divined, an inner voice whispered him that she was looking. He pretended to be absorbed in disgusted contemplation of a pimply dame who had stopped to talk with the great-aunt. He stuck to his guns for a space of 2 or 3 minutes until he was certain the Kirghiz